Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to the Korea Law Forum 2022, hosted by Korea Legislation Research Institute, Pacific Asian Legal Studies at William S. Richardson School of Law, the University of Hawaii in Manoa, and Center for Korean Studies at University of Hawaii in Manoa. My name is Kye-Hong from Korea Legislation Research Institute. And I would like to express our sincere gratitude to our invited guests here for taking time to be here with us today. And a special welcome to the speakers and discussants who are joining today online from Europe and Korea. This forum is a live streaming on Zoom, connecting 4 regions of Hawaii, Korea, Italy, and Spain. And legal scholars from these regions are going to discuss a range of legal issues under the theme of Korean laws from comparative perspectives. We have a simultaneous interpreting service today. Channel 1 is Korean and then channel 2 is English. And I also like to ask you to keep your mask on, and then you may want to not wear it when you are speaking on the stage. And now, without much further ado, we'll get the KLRI Law Forum 2022 starting now. And ladies and gentlemen, let me invite President of Korea Legislation Research Institute, Mr. Kye-Hong Kim, to open this forum. Please welcome Mr. Kye-Hong Kim.
네, 여러분 안녕하십니까? 한국법제연구원의 김규영 원장입니다. 한국법제연구원과 하와이 대학교 윌리엄 S. 리처드슨 로스쿨 아태 지역 법학 프로그램, 그리고 하와이 대학교 한국학연구소가 공동으로 주최하는 2022년 한국법 포럼에 참석해 주신 내기분 여러분 진심으로 환영합니다. 지난 2년간 전 세계적으로 코로나 바이러스 감염병이 유행하면서 매년 현장에서 직접 만나오던 한국법 포럼도 온라인으로 치를 수밖에 없었습니다. 2년의 기다림 끝에 마침내 길고 긴 터널을 벗어나 파란 하늘과 밝은 태양이 빛나는 하와이 현지에서 한국법 포럼을 개최할 수 있게 되어 더할 나위 없이 기쁩니다. 특히 2013년도 제2회 한국법 포럼 이후 10년 만에 하와이 대학교에서 다시 개최하게 되어서 참으로 의미가 깊습니다. 오늘 바쁘신 중에도 귀한 시간을 내어서 포럼에 참석해 주신 하와이 대학교 윌리엄 S. 리처드슨 로스쿨의 카밀 넬슨 학장님께 진심으로 감사드립니다. 또한 이번 포럼의 개최를 위해서 물심양면 힘써주신 하와이 대학교 로스쿨 교수이시면서 한국학연구소 소장이신 백태용 교수님께도 감사의 말씀을 전합니다. 또한 성공적인 포럼을 위해서 온라인과 오프라인으로 참석하신 발제자 및 포럼자 여러분께 깊은 감사를 드리며, 특히 하와이와 유럽 간의 시간 차이로 인해서 새벽 시간에 온라인으로 참석하여 자리를 빛내주시는 파울로 산 다이언 교수님과 안정철 교수님의 열정에 깊은 감사를 표합니다. 한국법 포럼은 2012년 제1회 포럼을 시작으로 지난 10여 년간 법학교육, 통합 프로세스, 아시아의 법치주의와 같은 다양한 주제에 관해서 국내 학자들 간의 토론의 장을 마련해 왔습니다. 상이한 법제 및 정책 간의 비교를 통해서 보다 발전된 입법 방안을 공부하고 외국법뿐만 아니라 우리 법에 대한 이해를 높일 수 있는 좋은 기회였습니다. 오늘 포럼에서는 비교법적인 관점에서 본 한국법이라는 주제하에 국내 법학자들을 모시고 심도 깊은 토론을 갖습니다. 세계 질서, 기후변화, 에너지, 지방증권, AI 등 세계적으로 관심이 높은 주요 주제들에 대해서 다양한 국가들이 어떻게 서로 다른 법제적 접근을 취하고 있는지 비교하고 상이한 입법 모델들의 특장점을 찾아보는 아주 흥미롭고 유익한 시간이 될 것입니다. 전문적이고 통찰력 있는 식견과 관점으로 주요 주제들에 대한 논의가 진행되어 뜻깊은 포럼이 진행되기를 기대하며 상이한 법제적 접근과 대안을 이해하고 배움으로써 상호 번영과 상호 성장의 계기를 마련할 수 있게 되기를 다시 한번 2022년 KLRI 포럼에 참석해 주신 모든 분들께 감사드리며 오늘 포럼이 개최될 수 있도록 힘써 주신 관계자 여러분께도 심심한 감사의 말씀드립니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Camille Nelson, Dean of William S. Richardson School of Law. Please join me in welcoming Dean Camille Nelson.
Good afternoon. As Dean of the William S. Richardson School of Law, it is my pleasure to warmly welcome you all to this wonderful event. Welcome to President Kye-Hong Lee from Korea Legislative Research Institute and his staff, professors, and fellow scholars. I also welcome our own law school colleagues and colleagues from the Center for Korean Studies who will also be sharing remarks and giving their presentations and their insights today. The event is co-sponsored, as was mentioned, by the William S. Richardson School of Law Pacific Asian Legal Studies Program, affectionately referred to as PALS, as well as the Center for Korean Studies at the University of Hawai'i. And I want to also acknowledge and welcome the wonderful visiting faculty members who are joining us today. It was such a pleasure to meet you briefly in the breakout room. The law school's PALS program is a very important part of the law school. Within PALS, we have strengths in a number of important areas, including expertise drawn from faculty who focus their academic and scholarly endeavors on China, Japan, Korea, and other parts of Asia under the leadership of Professor Mark Levin, who is here today. Nice to see you, Mark. We believe that our strength in Asian legal studies contributes to our domestic law curriculum as well, in addition to fueling the burgeoning global legal conversations that are necessary to foster greater unity and understanding. It is my great pleasure to continue our cooperation and collaboration with the Korea Legislative Research Institute that started many, many years ago under the leadership of Professor Tae-Ung Baik. Thank you, Tae-Ung. I understand that this is the second such K-Law forum to be hosted by KLRI and Richardson Law. I did not realize it had been a decade since we last welcomed you, so what an auspicious occasion to welcome you back. I hope this cooperation will continue well into our collective futures. And as you know, there are many challenges percolating in various legal fields, both domestically and internationally. The topics that will be discussed in this conference cover some of those very important legal matters. And I want to make sure to acknowledge and recognize our friends and colleagues who are joining us from Europe as well. My own husband works for the United Nations and he's based in The Hague, so I know it's late there. He is sleeping, but you're awake. Kudos to you and thank you. The topics that will be addressed and discussed in this very important event are some of the most pressing of our time. And I know you will have productive discussions during this conference, and I very much look forward to learning about these issues with you as we attempt to move forward together. So thank you for letting me spend this time with you and welcome.
Thank you very much. Now I'm pleased to invite Professor Tae-Ung Baik at William S. Richardson School of Law. He is also Director of the Center for Korean Studies at the University of Hawaii in Manoa. Please welcome Professor Tae-Ung Baik.
Good afternoon, President Kye-Hong Kim, Dean Camille, Professor Mark Levin, and distinguished guests. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the Center for Korean Studies at the University of Hawaii in Manoa. I'm so much delighted to co-host this KLRI forum in a hybrid format. I see some of my dear friends on screen. Hi, Professor Jung Lo, and also Professor Jong Chul-an, who is actually, Jong Chul-an is actually a graduate of our JD program, as you may know. And also, I'm very glad to meet old friends here in person, like Summer Kim and other professors. This KLO forum, titled Korean Laws from Comparative Perspectives, is a very, very timely and important occasion for us to think about emerging legal issues. And I'm very, very delighted that KLRI, Korea Legislation and Research Institute, initiated this KLO forum at this center in cooperation with the William S. Richardson School of Law, Pacific Asian Legal Studies program. KLRI is one of the key institutions supporting the Korean national legislative policy and assisting general legislative activities by systematically collecting and managing legislative information and surveying or researching juristic and legislative issues with extensive expertise possessed by the researchers in the institute. I have been collaborating with the KLRI more than a decade by now, and I'm very, very grateful for its continuous support for the overseas Korean law scholars and practitioners. In the past, Korea was considered as a constant importer of foreign law and legal scholarship. However, along with its development and consolidation of democracy, rule of law, and constitutionalism, its law and legal scholarship are drawing increasing international attention. In this sense, this K-Law Forum, which aims at globalization of Korean law and interchange of legal scholarships and legal thoughts, is more and more relevant and important. I'm grateful for President Kye-Hong Kim's visit to the University of Hawaii to share his views, facilitating this meaningful forum to share comparative perspectives on Korean law. And I'm so much delighted and happy to have this occasion to learn from my colleagues about important legal issues at this forum. I'd like to thank all speakers, discussants, participants for joining today's event. And also, I would like to recognize those staffs and assistants and also organizers of this conference. Actually, they started to work last Friday. And during this weekends, even if it is a long break, a long holiday, I'm really grateful for their endeavors and very happy to see this wonderful setting and everything working very well. I'm looking forward to learning more about Korean law and looking forward to our deeper dialogue during and after this conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, let me invite today's keynote speaker, Mr. Kye-Hong Kim, once again to the stage for his keynote speech. The topic of his speech is legislative procedure of Korea and legislators. Please give him a big hand.
네, 다시 나왔습니다. 매우 부담스러운 자리이기도 하고요. 제가 한국법제연구원장으로 있으면서 2년 8개월이 지났습니다. 제가 국내 학술 대회에서는 키노 스피치를 한 번 했었는데 이렇게 국제화된 장에서 외국에서 이렇게 키노 스피치를 하게 되리라고 생각도 못했는데 이렇게 자리하게 되어서 매우 영광스럽기도 하고 한편으로 점심이 체할 정도로 지금 굉장히 너버스한 상태에 있습니다. 오늘 한국법의 또 각국의 이제 다양한 법제를 가지고서 교재 발표들을 해주실 텐데 저는 이제 가장 기본이 되는 한국에서 도대체 법은 어떻게 만들어지는지에 대해서 여러분들이 혹시라도 관심이 있으실까 하는 그런 관점에서 한국 입법 과정을 한번 살펴보는 것으로 주제를 잡았습니다. 제가 그리고 또 제가 이제 한국의 제명으로는 한국의 입법 과정과 입법 주체라고 그렇게 잡았는데 입법 과정은 뭐 아시고 입법 주체는 뭐 입법 주체라는 것은 그 입법권은 국회에 있는 거 아니에요. 국회의원이 입법권을 행사하는 거다라고 보실 수 있는데 저는 이게 입법에 관여하는 자 정도로 생각을 하고 각 그 절차마다 해당되는 절차마다 크게는 행정부와 국회 간에 또 국회 안에서는 여당과 야당 간 또 그 각각의 절차 내에서는 어떠한 주체들이 어떠한 사람들이 주로 관여를 하는가의 관점에서 한번 훑어보는 게 좋겠다는 생각을 했고 제가 이런 이야기들을 할 수 있었던 것은 저는 오랫동안 29년 정도를 한국의 행정부에서 입법 절차를 관여하는 법제처라는 데서 공무원을 했었습니다. 그리고 그 공무하는 과정 중에 국회에 2년 정도, 특히 법제사법위원회 2년 정도를 파견 나가야 돼서 국회 입법 절차가 이렇게 또 되는구나라는 것을 확인을 하고 이걸 한번 정리해서 좀 세계적으로 알려드리면 좋겠다는 생각을 해서 그렇게 잡았다는 말씀을 드리고요. 저한테 주어진 시간이 25분인데 이 과정을 다 이야기하려고 들면 몇 시간도 모자랄 것 같고요. 그래서 뭐 제가 아는 범위 내에서만 또 말씀드리고 싶은 부분들만 주로 말씀을 드리는 쪽으로 해볼까 합니다. 대한민국 헌법에 대한 이야기인데요. 이 입법권은 국회에 속한다. 당연한 이야기죠. 그런데 대한민국 헌법에서는 국회의원과 행정부에도 법률안에 대한 제출권을 부여하고 있습니다. 그리고 제가 저기 원문은 모르겠는데 미국의 헌법에는 대통령은 법률이 충실하게 집행될 수 있도록 유의하며라고 하는 그런 규정이 있는데 그 규정에 기초해서 이그제큐티브 오더 등등의 하위 법령들을 만들어서 법률을 집행하는 그 행정부의 명령 체계들을 갖추고 있는 것으로 알고 있는데 대한민국 헌법에서는 대통령령과 통일령, 구령 등등의 근거를 직접 두고 있습니다. 75조에 따르면 대통령은 법률에서 구체적으로 범위를 정하여 위임받은 사항과 법률을 집행하기 위해 필요한 사항에 관해 대통령령을 발할 수 있다. 그리고 총리 또는 각부 장관도 마찬가지 그런 규정들을 두고 있습니다. 그러니까 특이한 점이 대한민국 헌법에는 대통령도 법률안을 제출할 수 있다라는 규정을 두고 있다는 점이고 행정법령에 대한 근거 규정을 직접 헌법에 두고 있다는 점에 특장점이 있다고 하겠습니다. 그래서 그걸 정리해보면 입법권은 국회에 속한다라는 게 분명한 것 같습니다. 근데 이제 좀 차이가 드는 게요. 제가 이게 원래는 있었는데 이게 사라진 휘트가 하나 있는데 13대 국회의 입법과 13대 국회라는 건 대한민국의 지금 21대 국회인데 13대 국회라면 1988년부터 1992년 사이입니다. 이 사이는 무슨 의미냐면은 권위주의 정부가 마지막 단계에 있을 때 그때와 지금 현재 2년 그러니까 지금 21대 국회 전반기 2년이 지금 막 지났거든요. 5월 30날 이 후반기 국회가 시작되는데 지금 아직 정리가 되지 않고 있습니다. 13대 국회 당시에 전체 4년간의 법안 제출 건수를 보니까 938건이 제출되었고요. 근데 21대 2년간 15,336건이 제출되어 있습니다. 국회가 입법에 대한 그 관심 또는 입법의 양이 엄청나게 늘었다는 것이죠. 근데 13대 국회 938건 중에 정부가 제출하는 건은 368건이었습니다. 40%에 육박하죠. 근데 368건 중에 정부 제출안이 국회에 최종적으로 법으로 통과된 게 355건이었습니다. 거의 대부분이 통과됩니다. 의원입법의 건수도 좋고 정부의 제출 건수가 워낙 많은데 정부 제출 건수가 대부분 통과되는 형태를 취하고 있다는 것인데 21대 국회에는 2년간 15,336건 중에서 정부가 491건을 제출했습니다. 5% 남짓 되나요? 그리고 정부에 제출된 안건이 260건 정도가 통과가 됐습니다. 그러니까는 예전에는 거의 대부분이 통과되는 거에서 지금은 반도 통과가 되지 않는 그런 상황이 이게 됐죠. 그래서 이런 양적인 부분에 있어서 국회가 확실히 입법권을 가지고 있다라고 하는 부분을 이야기할 수 있을 것 같고요. 정부 제출 법안은 갈수록 그 비중도 낮아지고 처리율도 낮아지고 그리고 혹시라도 통과가 된다 하더라도 대안이라는 형태로 해가지고 각각의 정부가 제출한 법도 있고 의원이 제출한 법도 있는데 그 통과돼야 될 내용만 추려가지고 대안 발의를 하게 됩니다. 그러면은 정부안은 사라지게 되죠. 그런 정도로 정부에 대한 정부의 제출안을 그대로 인정하지 않는 경향이 높아졌다라고 볼 수 있을 것 같고요. 그리고 입법에 소요되는 시간이 현격히 늘어나 있습니다. 지금은 그 법률안이 뭐 국회든 아니 국회의원이든 정부든 제출하게 되면 300일 정도의 시간을 300일 정도의 시간이 지나야 법안이 본회의로 통과되는 그런 정도로 이 논의 과정이 길다고 해야 될까요? 아니면은 논의를 안 하고 좀 방치하는 기간이 길어졌다고 할까? 이렇게 해서 그 입법권을 그 국회가 주도적으로 행사하는 방법을 여러 가지로 두고 있는데 정부 제출이나 뭐 의원 제출이든 간에 논의의 시간을 상당히 길게 잡고 있는 것으로도 입법권을 행사한다라고 그렇게 볼 수 있습니다. 근데 저는 그럼에도 불구하고 행정부는 입법권을 실질적으로 행사하는 주체다라고 보고 있습니다. 대한민국의 법령수는 법률, 시행령, 시행규칙을 다 포함해서 5,000건쯤 되는데요. 법률은 1,500건 정도가 됩니다. 나머지 3,500건은 시행령, 시행규칙이라는 이 행정부의 법령이죠. 그래서 행정부의 법령을 다 같이 갖추어야 법령의 체계가 갖추어진 거로 보기 때문에 행정부도 실질적인 주체가 된다. 그리고 대통령의 법률의 제출권이 인정되고 있다. 이런 등등. 그리고 헌법이 부여한 위임의 범위 내에서 자율적으로 입법권을 행사하는 주체라고 볼 수 있고 특히나 현대 행정환경이 급변하고 있고 복잡하고 정부가 비대칭적으로 행정부가 많이 갖고 있는 상황에서는 행정입법, 행정법령의 중요성이 여느 때 못지않게 크다라는 점을 여전히 인정할 수밖에 없을 것 같습니다. 그 다음에 이제 제가 그 행정부와 그 국회 간의 이제 갈등 부분을 제가 이제 이야기를 하고 싶은데요. 입법권을 둘러싼 국회와 행정부 간의 갈등이 있습니다. 이게 이제 그 행정입법은 법률이 정한 위임의 범위 내에서만 정해지는 한계를 갖고 있는데 행정부는 그 한계의 선상에서 넘나들면서 이 법령을 만드는 경우가 많습니다. 왜냐하면 앞에도 말씀드린 행정 환경은 급변하고 있기 때문에 법률에 위임된 범위 내에서만 정할 수 있겠냐라는 데 대해서 굉장히 좀 타이트하게 생각하면 못한다라고 해버리면 행정부 자체가 일을 안 한다라고 볼 수 있기 때문에 행정부는 좀 더 적극적으로 하위 법령을 정해서 이 어떤 환경, 입법이 필요한 환경을 타개해 나가려고 하는 그런 속성이 있는 것 같습니다. 그런 점들에서 갈등들이 좀 빚어지는데요. 우리 국회법에는 그 행정부의 하위 법령이 만들어지면 그 법령을 상임위원회에 제출하도록 하는 규정을 두고 있습니다. 그리고 상임위원회에서는 그 법령들이 법률의 취지나 내용에 합치되지 아니한다고 판단되는 경우에는 검토, 경과와 처리 의견 등을 기재한 검토 결과 보고서를 의장에게 제출하고 의장은 행정부에 그 내용을 전달하게 돼 있고요. 그러면은 행정부에서는 그 처리 여부를 검토하고 그 처리 결과를 국회에 제출하도록 하는 규정이 있는데 이것만으로는 국회의 법률을 명확하게 이행하고 있지 않는 하위 법령이다라고 했을 때 그걸 통제를 제대로 하지 못한다라는 한계를 국회에서는 인식을 하고 그 부분에 대해서 국회가 본회의에 의결한 내용이 중앙행정기관의 사항은 수정 변경 요청받은 사항을 처리하고 그 결과를 소관 상임위원회에 보고해야 한다라고 하는 규정을 본회의를 통과를 시켰습니다. 그러니까 이거는 좀 더 적극적으로 수정 의견을 제시하고 그 수정 의견을 반영한 하위 법령을 만들어서 그 결과를 제출하라 이렇게 한 것이죠. 이에 대해서 이게 벌써 제가 공무원 생활하던 때에 이미 2번의 이런 규정들의 과정이 있습니다. 근데 행정부는 그때그때마다 대통령의 거부권을 행사하면서 제2요구를 했습니다. 그 주된 이유는 국회 상임위가 요청한 대로 행정입법을 수정 변경해야 한다면 정부의 행정입법권을 침해해서 헌법에 위반될 소지가 크다. 그리고 법원이 아닌 국회 상임위가 행정입법의 법률 위반 여부를 심사하고 그 판단에 따라서 행정입법을 수정 변경하도록 한다면 행정입법에 대한 심사권을 법원에 부여하고 있는 헌법에 위반될 소지가 크다. 그리고 정부가 국회 상임위 요청에 따라서 행정입법을 수시로 변경하여야 한다면 정부 정책의 효율성과 일관성이 심각하게 저해돼서 정부 업무 수행에 중대한 차질을 초래할 우려가 있다. 이런 등등의 이유로 제2요구를 했고 결과적으로 좀 더 적극적으로 행정법령에 대한 통제권을 행사하려고 하는 국회법의 시도는 가결되었습니다. 그러니까 20대 국회에서도 그런 과정이 있었는데 임기 만료로 결국은 폐기가 됐죠. 이런 내용들을 보면 저는 앞에 이제 권위주의 정부 때 정부의 법률안 제출권이 얼마나 큰 영향력이 있었고 그리고 지금 현재 정부의 입법에 대한 영향력이 얼마나 작아지고 국회의 입법권이 커졌느냐에 대한 그런 어떤 그런 상황들에 대한 것입니다. 예전에 입법권을 주도하던 행정부가 이제는 국회가 주도하게 되는 상황에서 그 행정부의 입법권을 최대한 지키고자 하는 그런 일환으로 이런 일들이 벌어지고 있는 것 같다라고 저는 나름 판단을 하고 있습니다. 그리다가 보니 행정부에서는 또 이 환경, 이 모든 상황이 대한민국은 신문이나 방송을 보면 무슨 문제가 터지면 법이 있다 없다를 가지고 판단을 합니다. 행정부는 뭐 하고 있느냐라고 하는 그런 판단을 하게 되니 그런데 국회에서는 지금 특히 이제 이번 정부의 이제 윤석열 정부의 경우에는 여당이 멤버가 적습니다. 국회의원 수가 여당이 100명 정도에 불과하고 야당이 절대 다수를 차지하고 있거든요. 그러면은 여당이 추진하고자 하는 법을 쉽게 통과시킬 수가 없습니다. 그러니까 야당의 반대가 있으면 쉽게 통과시킬 수 없습니다. 그래서 바로 그러니까 어제 윤석열 대통령이 이런 말씀을 하셨더라고요. 규제에 대해서 과감한 철폐를 해야 된다. 그리고 대통령령과 부령으로 할 수 있는 규제들을 신속하게 처리해야 한다라고 말씀하셨습니다. 그러니까 정부가 규제라는 것은 기본적으로 국민의 권리 의무를 제한하는 내용이기 때문에 법률에 친한 내용이죠. 그런데 법률을 개정하는 환경이 쉽지 않은 환경이다. 그러니 대통령령이 행정부 내에서 할 수 있는 행정법령으로서 할 수 있는 그러한 내용들을 많이 발굴해서 최대한 규제를 줄이는 노력을 해야 된다라는 그런 말씀을 하신 거죠. 그러한 방법으로 이제 입법의 지연, 국회의 입법 활동으로 국회의 입법을 기다려서는 안 되는 그런 상황들에 대해서 해결하고자 하는 노력을 하고 있고, 그리고 이제 지난 정부 때부터 행정부에 적극 행정이라는 요청이 많이 요구되어 있습니다. 적극 행정은 기본적으로 행정부에서 지금 이런 여러 가지 상황들을 타개하기 위해서 행정부가 좀 더 적극적인 노력을 해야 됩니다. 특히 법령 관련된 사항에 대해서는 좀 더 해석도 적극적으로 하고, 그리고 이 법령의 신기술 신산업에 관련되는 법령의 경우에는 법령 규정이 없으면 규제가 없는 것으로 봐야 된다. 라는 그런 이야기들. 그리고 하위 법령을 적극적으로 활용해야 된다. 이런 이야기를 하고 있습니다. 그 밑에 제가 이제 유치원 3법이라고 해서 유치원의 경영자들이 원비를 받아서 부당하게 핸드백을 산다거나 이런 내용들을 규제할 필요성이 있다. 그런데 국회가 유치원이라는 데가 사립으로 만들어진 것이기 때문에 그 재산에 대해서 함부로 관여하지 못한다라는 입법 논의에서의 갈등들이 있어서 진행이 안 되니 하위 법령으로 먼저 재무에 대해서 투명하게 운영해야 한다는 그런 규정들을 뒀죠. 근데 그렇게 되고 그다음에 이제 여기서도 이제 패스트트랙이 공언이 되는데 그 법이 통과가 안 되니 패스트트랙에 태워가지고 결국 한 270일 후에 벌칙 규정을 두면서 입법이 완성되는, 그래서 하위 법령으로 먼저 조치할 때 조치하고 나중에 법률로 완성되는 그런 과정을 거쳤던 이런 내용들이 국회가 입법이 입법 활동이 원활하지 못하면 행정부는 행정부 나름대로의 역할을 해야 된다라는 그런 데서 이런 이야기를 할 수 있습니다. 그래서 제가 이제 종합적으로 보면 입법부와 행정부와의 권한 관계는 입법에 대한 권한과 책임을 각각 나누어 갖고 있다라고 그렇게 정리를 할 수 있을 것 같습니다. 거기 밑에 미국의 그 의회 중심주의와 비교하는 내용을 제가 잘 알지는 못해서 설명을 드리기는 못할 것 같고요. 미국은 아마 하위법령에 대해서 대통령령에 대해서 양원이 적극적으로 관여를 해서 뭐 무효화시키거나 하는 조치가 있을 것 같은데 우리는 앞에 말씀드린 것처럼 삼권 분립을 좀 더 엄격하게 적용해야 한다는 그런 관점에서 있다라는 그런 정도의 말씀을 드릴 수 있을 것 같고요. 이런 것들도 뭐 비교 분석하고 논문을 쓰면 좋을 것 같다라는 생각을 좀 해봅니다. 자, 그다음에 이제 입법 과정에 대해서 제가 이제 볼 건데요. 행정부의 입법 과정을 살펴보도록 하겠습니다. 국회의 입법 과정은 단일한 법 체계로 되어 있습니다. 국회법에는 단일한 법 체계로 되어 있는데 행정부는 여러 법들이 단일한 법 체계가 없습니다. 행정부의 입법 과정도 단일한 법 체계로 해야 되는 거 아니냐라는 요구를 국회에서 많이 합니다. 입법 절차에 대해서. 입법 절차법을 만약에 만든다 치면 입법 절차를 만든다, 법률을 만든다 치면 그 법률은 국회의 구속적인 어떤 국회로부터 어떤 굉장히 구속을 받는 그런 절차들이 될 거다라고 해서 행정부는 아직 이 종합적인 입법 절차를 두고 있지는 않고 각각의 대통령령 또는 필요한 기본권을 제한하는 내용 또는 국민의 참여를 보장하는 것들을 법으로 보장하는 행정절차법이나 규제를 심사하는 행정규제 기본법 등등 외에는 대통령령의 규정으로 두고 있습니다. 지금 몇 시까지 해야 되죠? 예. 자, 그 행정부 입법 절차는 굉장히 복잡하다는 절차를 갖고 있습니다. 아마도 저는 그렇게 생각을 합니다. 그 예전에 입법 주도권이 행정부에 있었기 때문에 행정부 입법 절차를 정치하게 만들어 놓지 않으면 법이 어느 특정의 이해를 반영하는 법이 될 거다라는 그런 우려심이 있어서 좀 더 절차적으로 좀 갖춰져 있고 그리고 이해관계를 충분히 조정할 수 있는 그런 절차를 갖도록 하자라는 그런 아마 총정이 있었던 거 아닌가라는 저는 그런 생각을 하고 있습니다. 근데 의원 발의 법안의 경우는 의원 10명이면 바로 법률안으로서 국회에 제출되거든요. 그런데 행정부의 입법은 이런 많은 절차를 거쳐가지고 국회에 제출되기 때문에 그래서 행정부는 실제로 아까 통계에서 보셨지만 지금은 5% 내용은 행정부 제출 법률로 돼 있거든요. 그러니까 대부분 많은 입법 소스들이 정부에서 발생하고 있음에도 불구하고 정부는 사실상 의원들을 통해서 이 법률안 제출하는 과정을 거치게 된다. 그래서 이제 행정부는 좀 더 입법 절차를 효율화하겠다라는 그런 요구를 받게 되고 그런 과정이 진행되고 있지만 월등하게 의원들의 법률안 제출이 용이하기 때문에 지금은 대세는 법률안 제출에 있어서는 대부분 넘어가 있는 것 같다. 뭐 그럼에도 불구하고 행정부 입법 절차는 중요한데 그 부분을 뭐 계속 제가 말씀을 드리겠습니다. 맨 처음에 이제 법률안을 입안할 필요가 있죠. 아까도 말씀을 드렸듯이 사회적인 문제가 발생하면은 법의 존재 여부를 먼저 따지게 됩니다. 법이 있다 또는 법이 없다, 법이 또 부실하다 이런 등등의 요구로 법을 제정 또는 개정하는 요구를 항상 받게 됩니다. 그리고 그리고 행정부 입장에서도 법을 먼저 만들고 보자라고 접근하는 것이 다른 재원을 조달하는 것보다 더 용이할 수도 있습니다. 그런 측면에서 일단 법률안의 입안을 해야 될 필요성을 사회로부터 자꾸 요구를 받는다는 것이죠. 근데 정부가 법률안을 입안한다고 했을 때 정부의 관료들이 예전에는 대부분 입안을 했었습니다. 근데 지금은 관료들은 현안에 대한 어떤 사회 문제 제기, 민원 제기에 많이 매여 있습니다. 그래서 법률안을 차분하게 돌고 만들고 개정안을 만들고 하는 그러한 집중력을 발휘하지 못하는 것 같습니다. 그래서 필요한 기간이 한국법제연구원 같은 기관입니다. 한국법제연구원에서 정부로부터 많은 요구를 받아서 법률안을 만들고 문제점을 정리하고 외국의 제도를 분석하고 그리고 만들어진 이후에 만들어진 정부에 납품하고 난 다음에 해외 대응하는 것까지도 대응을 많이 하고 있거든요. 그래서 이제 한국법제연구원이 입법에 대한 관여자로서 정부 제출뿐만 아니라 의원 법안에 대한 관여자로서 역할을 많이 하고 있다라는 점을 이 자리에서는 말씀드리고 싶습니다. 그다음에 이제 부처협의 과정인데요. 부처협의는 대단히 중요한 과정입니다. 대한민국의 부처는 18개 부처가 있고요. 18개 부처가 어찌 보면은 각 그 사회 분야의 이해관계를 대변한다고 볼 수 있습니다. 그러니까 이해관계를 대변한다는 얘기는 그 각각의 이해 집단들이 해당되는 부처를 통해서 법률안의 저지 또는 내용 변경 또는 그 추진을 요구를 한다는 것이죠. 근데 그러니까 부처는 중립자의 견지에서 하지만 아무래도 이해관계에 소속돼 있다면 그 방향으로의 추진을 강력하게 밀고 나갈 것입니다. 그래서 부처협의 과정이라는 것이 필요하다고 저는 보여지는데요. 이게 굉장히 중요한 절차라고 보는데 부처협의의 이후 단계가 차관회의, 국무회의라고 해서 의사결정을 하는 협의체인데요. 차관회의, 국무회의 멤버가 부처들입니다. 그래서 그 부처의 협의 결과 충족이 되지 않는다면 다음 단계로 넘어갈 수가 없습니다. 그래서 부처의 협의가 굉장히 중요한 단계다라고 규정상으로는 대한민국 법제무 운영 규정을 하는 규정상으로는 10일 이상의 부처협의를 해야 된다라고 되어 있지만은 부처협의는 차관의 국무회의 될 때까지도 계속되는 과정이다라고 그렇게 볼 수 있을 것 같습니다. 네, 그 다음에 이제 입법예고인데요. 입법예고는 국민들의 의견을 듣는 자리입니다. 국민들의 의견을 듣는 자리가 예전에 20일 이상이었는데요. 미국의 USTR 통상 쪽에서 한국의 입법 과정이 투명하지 않다라는 불만 때문에 20일에서 40일로 늘었습니다. 그 40일을 봤더니 미국 대사관에서 한국 법령안을 접수하는 단계에 그걸 번역하고 보내고 저쪽 본부에서 의견을 받고 다시 또 번역해서 제출하기에는 최소 40일이 걸린다 해가지고 40일 이상으로 지금 의견들을 수렴하게 되어 있고요. 대한민국에서는 입법 예고를 해서 국민의 의견을 받으면 반드시 답을 하게 돼 있고 그 답을 그 답 중에서 새로운 내용을 변경해야 될 것 같으면 변경한 내용에 대해서도 입법 예고를 다시 해서 다른 국민들이 알 수 있도록 그렇게 절차적으로 굉장히 의미 있게 활용되고 있는 것이다라고 하는 것이 입법 예고다라고 말씀드릴 수 있을 것 같습니다. 그다음에 이제 근래 들어서 가장 마지막에 생긴 제도가 이제 규제심사인데요. 규제심사는 규제를 신설하는 내용 또는 규제를 폐지하더라도 국민의 생명과 안전에 위협이 되는 내용들의 경우에는 규제심사를 반드시 거치도록 하고 있습니다. 그래서 규제가 신설될 필요가 있는지를 소명을 해야 되고 신설될 필요가 있는 것을 외부 전문가들로 하여금 승인을 받도록 하는 제도가 규제심사제도입니다. 이 규제심사제도가 어찌 보면 부처협의 마지막 단계라고 할 수 있을 것 같고요. 그러나 최근에 이제 규제심사를 하면서도 신기술 서비스에 대해서는 규제 샌드박스 등등을 허용하라. 원칙적으로는 사후에 규제를 하고 우선 허용하는 제도를 해라라는 그런 원칙적인 규정들을 가지고서 운영하고 있습니다. 그 다음에 이제 법제처 심사라고 하는 대단히 특이한 제도를 가지고 있습니다. 법제처라고 하는 제가 이제 소속된 기관이기도 하고요. 예전에 소속되었던 부처는 이해관계 집단에 둘러싸여서 특정 이해관계를 대변할 수도 있다라고 하는데 법제처라는데 이해관계 집단이 부처 자체가 이해관계 집단이어서 가장 독립되고 공정한 절차를 가지고서 그 법령의 전체 체계의 정합성을 볼 수 있다라고 해서 법제처 심사라는 제도를 두고 있고 이 법제처 심사가 정부 안에서는 어떻게 보면 가장 마지막 단계의 게이트키퍼 역할을 한다. 규제의 필요성이나 입법의 필요성에 대해서 최종적으로 확인하는 그런 과정을 거치고 있습니다. 법제처에 대한 소개를 제가 잠시 했고요. 이게 정부 조직 이후로 살아있는 세계 부처 중에 하나이다라고 그렇게 이야기를 하고 최근에 동남아시아 국가에서 법제처라는 단일한 심사 해석 시스템을 자기 나라에 만들겠다라고 하는 그런 시도도 있었다는 소개도 말씀드리겠습니다. 그 다음에 이제 차관의 국무회의 심의인데 아까 말씀드렸듯이 차관의 국무회의를 하기 위해서는 부처협의가 완료돼야 됩니다. 부처협의가 조금이라도 미진돼 있으면 차관의 국무회에서 발언을 해서 저지를 시킬 수 있기 때문에 이 절차가 이제 과반수 예, 동의를 받아서 할 수 있다라는 그런 규정들이 있지만은 사실상 만장일치로 운영되기 때문에 그 이전에 부처협의가 굉장히 중요하다라는 말씀입니다. 그 다음에 이제 그 대통령의 재가를 거쳐서 법률의 경우에는 국회에 제출되게 되고요. 그 다음에 대통령령의 경우에는 이제 공포하는 절차를 밟게 되고, 부령은 각부 장관들이 바로 공포하는 과정을 거칩니다. 제가 이제 3분 정도 남았다고 해서요. 국회 입법 절차는 제가 보기에는 여느 나라나 다를 바 없을 것 같습니다. 국회 입법 절차는 여느 나라나 다를 바 없고, 최근에 이제 대한민국에서 이제 새로 추가된 게 저희는 무제한 토론이라고 하고 미국에서는 필리버스터라고 하는데 그 내용을 제가 한번 말씀드리는 것으로 하고 마칠까 합니다. 필리버스터라고 하는 대한민국에서 하도 이제 국회 내에서 갈등이 많으니 어떻게든지 법을 통과시키자라는 의도로 사실은 무제한 토론을 만들었고, 미국은 필리버스터가 우연의 소선이고 어쨌든 핵이 불개 속에 의해서 저지될 수 있는 그런 제도로 설계가 됐는데, 대한민국은 통과되는 것을 전제로 이 제도를 설계해서 가장 큰 차이점이 그거 같습니다. 무제한 토론이 종결될 수 있는, 그러니까 3분의 2의 정족수에 종결되거나 회기가 끝나서 종결되거나 종결되면 그 다음 회기에 바로 항정이 된다라는 큰 차이가 있는 것 같습니다. 결국에는 대한민국의 무제한 토론은 토론과 타협의 문화가 좀 더 정착되는 것을 국회법에서 선도해 나가자는 그 의도를 가지고서 했기 때문에 이렇게 전국적으로는 막지 않고 결과에 대해서 보팅이 가능한 그런 체제로 설계가 돼 있다. 그래서 지금 특장점이 최근에 지금 무제한 토론은 찬반 토론을 계속 번갈아가면서 하는 그런 체제로 붙여져 있습니다. 그러니까 어찌 보면은 애초에 의도했던 토론과 타협을 통해서 물론 결과는 토론은 있고 타협은 없이 어느 일방의 의사대로 전국적으로 이제 결론이 나지만 어쨌든 토론의 형식을 취하고 찬반 토론의 형식을 취하고 최종적으로 이 투표를 하는 절차로 설계가 되어 있고 그렇게 운영되고 있는 점은 나름의 다행스러운 점 아닌가라는 생각을 하고 있습니다. 제가 아는 게 없어서 시간도 짧고 그래서 이렇게 마치겠습니다. 나중에 국회나 정부 입법 활동에 대해서 보실 수 있는 제가 유스포라는 사이트를 몇 개를 찾아놨는데요. 그걸 보시면 대한민국 입법이 진행되고 있고 어떤 것들이 논의 중에 있고 어떤 것이 통과가 됐는지를 알 수 있는 것 같습니다. 자, 여기까지 제가 준비한 것을 마치도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다. 네.
Thank you very much for the informative presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, without break, we're going to proceed with the first session. And I'd like to ask the speaker, moderator, and discussants for session 1 to come up to the stage. I'm sorry, but we need 5 minutes break, so we'll start in 5 minutes. Session 1 starts for 5 minutes. At 2:25. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now starting the first session. The moderator of this session is Dr. Hyun-Soon, Senior Research Fellow at Korea Legislation Research Institute. And then she will take over this stage now. Please welcome Dr. Hyun-Soon.
네, 안녕하십니까. 저는 한국법제연구원에서 기획조정 실적을 맡고 있는 소년입니다. 오늘 이 자리에 함께하게 되어서 무한한 영광입니다. 11번째로 개최되는 이제 K-로 포럼은 이번에 하와이 로스쿨 아시아 태평양 법학 프로그램과 한국학 연구소와 함께 준비했습니다. 한국법제연구원은 한국법, 그러니까 한국과 한국법이라는 이렇게 공통의 관심사를 가진 해외 다양한 연구기관들 그리고 학자들과 학술 교류의 장으로 K-로 포럼을 매년 개최하고 있습니다. 특히 이번에 하와이 대학의 한국학 연구소가 50년 되는 해에 같이 이렇게 개최하게 되어서 굉장히 기쁘게 생각합니다. 그럼 본격적인 제1세션에 들어가기 전에 제1세션의 참가자분들을 소개해 드리겠습니다. 첫 번째로 이제 발제를 맡아주신 노종호 콜롬비아 법학선의 한국 법학센터장님을 소개해 드리겠습니다. 지금 화상으로 참여해 주고 계십니다. 네, 두 번째 발표를 맡아주신 현준원 한국법제연구원 박사를 소개해 드리겠습니다. 네, 그럼 토론을 맡아주신 김대인 이화여자대학교 법학전문대학원 교수님이십니다. 네, 다음은 한승수 중앙대학교 법학전문대학원 교수님이십니다. 네, 제1세션의 주제는 코리안 퀘스천과 이제 클라이밋 체인지에 대한 주제를 다루고 있습니다. 둘 다 국제사회에서 굉장히 중요한 이슈들인데요. 먼저 첫 번째로 이제 노정호 교수님의 발제를 듣도록 하겠습니다. 첫 번째 발제는 영상으로 준비되어 있습니다.
For my presentation today, I've chosen a very broad topic called Reframing the Korean Question in the Context of the Emerging New World Order, which admittedly is a bit of a mouthful, but it is essentially a reformulation of the issues surrounding the Korean Peninsula in light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how this has impacted the world at large and in particular the Korean Peninsula. As is evident by the title, there are two components to my presentation. The first is being, what is the Korean question? And how do we need to reframe this? And the second is a more rhetorical question on the emerging new world order. I mean, is there actually a emerging new world order, so-called Cold War 2.0? Or is this just a continuation of the original Cold War after a short 30-year pause following the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991? The post-World War II UN-based international order is something that has been a part of international relations since 1945. And what is remarkable about the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022 is that although this is not the first time something like this has happened, it really has fundamentally changed the equation of the way nations interact with each other under this system that was formulated in 1945. And it changes the equation not only for European security in Europe, but it has also rewritten and reshaped how we look at international order post-World War II in 1945. Now, as an example, challenges to the international order is not something that is new. And one of the prime examples is actually the Korean War. The Korean War stands as an early example of challenges to this newly created United Nations system post-World War II by the boycott of the Security Council by the Soviet Union over its defeat of the proposal to unseat the Republic of China in the Security Council in favor of the People's Republic of China. And in essence, the boycott by the Soviet Union of the Security Council inadvertently allowed the Security Council to adopt a resolution condemning the Korean War without the veto of the Soviet Union. And in a way, inadvertently or ironically, this had a positive effect for Korea. And had the Soviet Union not boycotted or had not challenged the United Nations, perhaps the result would be quite different than the way we know of it today. And of course, the Russian-Ukrainian war turns now as another example of the challenges to the international world order based on the United Nations. And we ask the question, really, is the Russia-Ukraine war a turning point that heralds a new global, I think, not order, but a new global disorder? And the failure of the Security Council in this instance, which is in contrast to the Korean War example, to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think stands in very dark contrast to the events surrounding the Korean War in 1950, and also stands as an example of the inherent flaws of the UN and the problematic nature of the veto powers of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. So to get to the origins of the Korean question, I'd like to paraphrase comments made by others in describing Korea, and they describe it as Koreans live in a really rough neighborhood. Korea is surrounded by big powers with interests that are not necessarily consistent with Korean interests, and needless to say, Korea is surrounded by 3 nuclear weapons states: China, Russia, and North Korea, to be countered by Japan and the United States. And this position that Korea finds itself in today, being surrounded by these large powers and perhaps hostile powers, is a position that is not unfamiliar to Korea and Korean history. And it goes back perhaps to the mid to late 1800s. One of my favorite descriptions of Korea comes from a book published in 1907 by George Hubert Jones called Korea, the Land, People, and Customs, where he observes that Korea, and I'm quoting here, and the quote is in the PowerPoint presentation, that Korea has been likened in shape to a rabbit, caught by the ear and held by Russia at Vladivostok. But it appears like a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. And in fact, such was the fear that Japan had about this dagger, which is Korea, that early history tells a story of Japan first wresting the dagger away from China, and then wresting it away from Russia, and then finally taking control of the dagger. And that, of course, is the story of the 3 wars, well, 2 wars and the colonization that occurred in the 1800s to the early 1900s, and echoes the familiar position that Korea being caught between larger and more powerful neighbors is not something that is new. And of course, as the slide shows, the first is, of course, the result of Japan's attempt to wrestle control over Korea from China and the defeat of China in the Sino-Japanese War, which culminated in 1895 on the Treaty of Shimonoseki, where the kind of symbolically important part of this treaty is that for the first time, by the terms of the treaty, Japan forces China to recognize Korea as an independent state. And the reason for this is that to break the tributary relations or the traditional relations that Korea had with China and now begin a relations based on the Western concept of international law, Korea had to be recognized as an independent nation, and hence the 1895 treaty is quite significant in that regard. But as you will see, the very independence that of Korea that Japan had forced China to recognize under this newly formed international law principle per the 1895 treaty gets immediately taken away following the defeat of Russia during the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. And here the first era of the Korean question that we talk about really comes to an end during the period from 1905 to 1910, when essentially now Japan takes over Korea and puts an end to this Korean question as to how the nations will now look at Korea as part of Northeast Asia. And of course, the Korean question that evolved from the demise of China and then the demise of Russia, and ultimately an understanding with the United States that gives Japan the sole rights to the Korean Peninsula. The Korean question part 2, post-1945, is one that I think most of you are very familiar with, and essentially again, reverts to the concept of independence. In this instance, whether Korea is capable of governing themselves. The Cairo Declaration provides, in 1943, a very short-lived promise of independence that ultimately resulted not really in independence, but a division of Korea. And the United Nations, as part 2 of the Korean question, takes up this issue of unification and international recognition of this divided nation and what are the rights of the entire Korean people. I'm not really aware of any other country except perhaps Palestine that really has the word question after the country name. But the kind of recent genesis of the Korean question or the problem of Korea stems from the debate in the United Nations in 1947 and how the international community, and this time under the United Nations, struggles with defining the Korean sovereignty, Korean independence, etc., is what consumes the debate going forward from that day on. Paradoxically, the Korean question is not per se about how Korea resolves its question, but how the interests of the powers surrounding Korea intersect on the Korean Peninsula. And of course, the 1990s, more recently, the Korean question regarding sovereignty and independence is largely answered by the simultaneous entry of both Koreas to the United Nations. And as the second part of the Korean question regarding who is the true representative of the Korean people, the United Nations actually answers that Korean question by the simultaneous entry of both Koreas to the United Nations. And in the early 2000s, the kind of Korean question now takes on a new face. And this face is really revolves around North Korea's nuclear issue. And an interesting parallel can be made to the early 1900s, where the interests of the big powers in the regions and the present-day efforts to resolve the nuclear and unification intersect with each other. Korea, or North Korea, as the Hermit Kingdom, inadvertently takes on the same name as the Joseon Kingdom, which had been known also as the Hermit Kingdom. And the term, the Korean question, is coined not by Korea, but by other nations to illustrate the difficulty in resolving the issues, and from beginning with unification, inter-Korean relations, and now the nuclear problems. But importantly, I think, signals the multilateral efforts without necessarily the direct input of the parties in interest or in direct interest North and South Korea. Interestingly, as a side note on this, in 1972, North Korea changed its constitution to name the capital from Seoul to Pyongyang. So prior to 1972, Seoul was still the capital of North Korea. And perhaps this change in 1972 is a recognition by North Korea that division may be more than just temporary. And the new capital, from the traditional capital from Joseon era to the Korean Empire, I think signifies this kind of interesting change in North Korea, and perhaps a shifting of the recognition that the Korean question, as far as who is the true owner, representative of Korea, is not going to be resolved anytime soon. Then on to the Korean question, part 3. And I'll try to speed up a little bit, so I think we're running a little bit short on time. But the emerging new world order. The next slide, number 11. Biden was recently in Korea, and you can quote him as saying, the war against Ukraine isn't just a matter for Europe. It's an attack on democracy and the core international principles of sovereignty, and the Republic of Korea and the United States are standing together as part of a global response with our allies and partners around the world. One observation that we can make from the Ukraine war is that what we're witnessing is a weakening of the very international institutions that make up the world order as we knew of it since 1945. And I think this is particularly true of the Security Council and the failure of the Security Council to condemn Russian aggression against another sovereign state. I think highlights the core of this problem with the United Nations going forward. And a more recent failure, obviously, was the inability of the United Nations Security Council to condemn North Korea's new ballistic missile launch due to a highly fractured Security Council stemming from the Ukraine war. And one question that we might ask is, going forward, what would then be the response for a potential future nuclear weapons test by North Korea, or even a potential Chinese aggression against Taiwan? How would the Security Council now function in such a event? The emerging new world order, in whichever form it takes, I think needs to be looked into context, or stated in the context of this weakening of the very institutions that we have looked upon as the basis of world order since 1945, and specifically, obviously, we're talking about the Security Council. Then one quick point I wanted to make is then how is the world now being divided? And is it democracies versus autocracies? But that definition doesn't really work too well. And once we start putting labels on how the world is becoming divided, I think we run into definitional issues. But one thing that is quite clear, I think, is that the definition of West is something that we need to clarify quite clearly. We say the West is against this. And really, when we say the West, and quote unquote the West, we're not talking about the West based on geography. We're not saying it's Europe. For instance, a good part of Russia is located in Europe, but it's not considered the West, so to speak. Likewise, Australia is not located in Europe, but it is considered part of the West. And likewise, the same applies to Japan. And really, if liberal democratic values are what defines the West, then surely I think South Korea would be included in the definition of the West. And the recent, I think, Korean presidential election of President Yoon Suk-yeol and the Ukraine war, to a large degree, has cemented South Korea's position as a responsible member of the West, alongside with the non-European West members, Japan and Australia and others. Gist of my presentation really is this final part, which I'll very quickly just go through because we're running a little short on time, is there are two emerging new world orders that we see. And the first is the unintended expansion of NATO, and the second is the very controversial topic relating to nuclearization debate in Korea and Japan. The significance of the recent abandonment of neutrality by three European nations, really, Switzerland, Finland, and Sweden, I think in a sense marks a remarkable departure from the norms that it had existed. For instance, Sweden has maintained neutrality for over 200 years. And Finland, after the 1939 war with Russia, has maintained neutrality. And now the quest to join NATO really has changed fundamentally the way international order had been existent in the past years. And of course, Switzerland now joining the sanctions against Russia in itself is an abandonment of that long neutrality that these three countries have enjoyed. And it's a very significant, I think, event. Japan has obviously had the three no nuclear principles, not possessing, producing, or permitting introduction of nuclear weapons. And there is quite a lot of history regarding the nuclear weapons in Japan. But Korea, I think, is slightly different in this regard. That a recent poll suggests that I think actually Koreans are actually in favor of reintroduction of nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula, or the extended deterrence. And I draw a parallel with the abandonment of neutrality by Finland and Sweden to join NATO, in a sense to ensure kind of national security or security interests. They need to join NATO as a result of the aggression by Russia. And the parallel that I draw here is that rhetorically, should not the same actually be true in the Korean case, where now we are faced with a direct nuclear threat from a hostile North Korea? And what is the security guarantee? Or how do we ensure or guarantee the security of Korea? And I think that's an important question that going forward that we need to be, I think, quite attuned to. Of course, this has to be distinguished between actually South Korea possessing nuclear weapons and hosting or sharing of nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. And there's nothing in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, that prevents or prohibits the hosting of nuclear weapons. U.S. nuclear weapons have been hosted in countries like Germany, Turkey, and so forth. And I would hope that this would be an opportunity for us to kind of rethink the nuclear posture that we have actually maintained since the early 1990s on the Korean Peninsula. And in the next slide, I've just noted that the ICJ, the advisory opinion where the legality of the use of nuclear weapons was discussed, this is that there's no source of law, customary or in treaty, that actually explicitly prohibits the possession or even use of nuclear weapons. And the nuclear doctrines that I mentioned in the PowerPoint below, you'll see that in extreme circumstances, in the case of the United States or in Russia, which jeopardizes the existence of the Russian state, and in the case of North Korea, the nuclear doctrine, I think, encompasses or includes preemptive strikes as part of its nuclear doctrine. So in the interest of time, I'm going to be skipping the three slides, 21, 22, 23, and just basically conclude by mentioning the mutual defense treaties as my conclusion. This is that the question I ask here is that is the Korea-U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty, 1953, that was made, really equivalent to the NATO Article 5 collective action that is included in NATO. And the reason I think it's important for us to have this kind of framework is that essentially South Korea depends on the Mutual Defense Treaty as the sole kind of guarantor of aggression against North Korea and its nuclear weapons. And I think we need to be quite confident in our own minds that, in fact, it does rise to the level of Article 5 of NATO. For if it did not, then essentially we have a kind of illusory defense problem. at hand. So with that, let me end. And I just want to mention that this was actually recorded about a week ago on May 24th. And so any subsequent events that might have occurred up to today, I think we can talk about in more detail during the question and answer. For that, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion.
네, 노정 교수님 발표 잘 들었습니다. 좀 더 심도 깊은 논의는 이후 토론 시간에 또 자세히 나누도록 하겠습니다. 그럼 이어서 바로 두 번째 주제인 한국의 기후변화 법제 현황과 전망이라는 주제로 현준원 박사의 발표를 듣도록 하겠습니다.
예, 안녕하십니까. 한국법제연구원의 현준원입니다. 앞에서는 영어로 발제해 주셨지만 저는 한국어로 발제를 하도록 하겠습니다. 앞에서 노 교수님께서 아주 거대 담론과 관련된 얘기를 해 주셨습니다. 제가 발표하게 될 기후변화도 물론 거대 담론이긴 합니다만 한 분야에 해당되는 문제이기 때문에 노 교수님 발제처럼 아주 거대한 시각은 아닌 것 같습니다. 그럼에도 불구하고 최근 국제사회에서 기후변화 문제가 가장 핫 이슈인 것만큼은 분명한 것 같습니다. 그런 관점에서 한국이 기후변화 문제를 어떻게 다루고 있는지에 대해서 많은 분들이 궁금해하실 거라는 생각이 들어서 이 주제를 선정했습니다. 저는 우선 탄소 중립이 무엇인가, 왜 탄소 중립인가와 관련된 말씀을 간단하게 드리고, 그 다음에 현재 한국에서는 이 탄소 중립을 달성하기 위해서 또는 기후변화에 대응하기 위해서 어떤 법제도를 갖추고 있는가와 관련된 말씀을 드리겠습니다. 그 이후에는 잘 아시다시피 한국이 최근에 대통령 선거를 통해서 정부가 교체됐습니다. 이제 정권이 바뀌다 보니까 정책의 방향이 조금 바뀔 수도 있지 않을까라는 생각을 하실 수 있을 것 같아서 향후 새로운 정부에서의 그 기후변화 정책의 방향은 어떻게 갈 것으로 전망되는지를 한번 말씀드려 보도록 하겠습니다. 우선 간단하게 탄소 중립 얘기를 좀 드리겠습니다. 제가 한 10여 년 전에 기후변화와 관련된 무슨 발제를 하게 되면 가장 먼저 기후변화가 뭐고 왜 문제이고 이거 빨리 대응하지 않으면 큰일 납니다라는 얘기부터 드렸어야 됐습니다. 그런데 지금은 한국에서도 마찬가지지만 국제사회에서 가장 중요한 이슈로 다루어지는 문제이기 때문에 기후변화가 왜 문제인지 이런 부분에 대해서는 굳이 설명이 필요 없는 것 같습니다. 다만 계속 1.5도 목표를 얘기하고 있기 때문에 1.5도 목표는 도대체 왜 나온 건지 예서부터 얘기를 조금 풀어가야 될 것 같습니다. 국제사회에서 기후변화 문제를 얘기하면서 산업화 이전에 대비해서 온도가 2도 이상 올라가면 큰일 난다. 그리고 사실은 2도도 굉장히 위험한 수치이기 때문에 1.5도 이하로 묶어야 된다라는 얘기를 합니다. 그것이 공식적인 문건에서 처음 등장하는 것이 잘 알고 계시는 파리 협정에서입니다. 파리 협정에서는 2도 이하를 유지하기 위해서 노력하고 최대한 이제 1.5도를 준수한다 이런 이제 표현이 들어가 있습니다. 밑에 표에서 보시는 것처럼 1.5도와 2도는 굉장히 많은 차이를 발생시킨다고 합니다. 폭염 같은 것이 올 때 1.5도 정도가 상승했을 때는 평소에 비해서 한 4도 정도 이런 정도의 온도 상승이 있는데 2도로 올라가면 6도 가까운 온도 상승이 일어납니다. 폭염 발생도 1.5도 상승이라고 해서 안전한 거는 사실 아니고 폭염 자체도 평소에 비해서 4배 정도는 더 발생할 우려가 있는데 2도로 올라가면 거의 6배 가까이 증가하게 됩니다. 산호는 거의 2도가 되면 전멸 수준에 이르를 우려가 굉장히 높다고 합니다. 그러니까 1.5도와 2도가 불과 0.5도의 차이이긴 하지만 굉장히 인류의 생존을 위협하는 그 수준이 상당히 달라지기 때문에 가능하면 1.5도 이하로 묵자는 것이 국제사회의 목표입니다. 그러면 보통 2050년까지 탄소 중립, 그러니까 인류가 배출하는 이산화탄소와 그것을 흡수하는 이산화탄소의 양을 플러스 마이너스 제로를 만드는 상태를 탄소 중립이라고 얘기하는데, 이 탄소 중립을 왜 2050년까지는 달성해야 된다라고 얘기하느냐? 이것이 바로 이제 그 UN IPCC라는 기구에서 발표한 그 보고서 때문입니다. 이 보고서에서 역시 2도 이상 일어나면 이제 굉장히 돌이킬 수 없는 재앙이 일어날 수도 있기 때문에 1.5도 이내로 온도 상승을 억제해야 한다라고 얘기하면서 이를 달성하기 위해서는 전 지구적으로 2050년까지 탄소 중립을 달성해야 한다라고 얘기하고 있습니다. 그래서 이제 2050년까지는 탄소 중립을 달성하고 이것을 달성하기 위해서는 2030년, 그러니까 불과 한 8년 후쯤이죠. 그때까지 최고점, 그러니까 온실가스를 가장 많이 배출했던 시점을 기준으로 약 한 45% 정도는 줄여줘야 그 속도로 갔을 때 2050년이 되면 탄소 중립까지 갈 수 있다. 이렇게 이제 보고서가 나와 있습니다. 뭐 좀 암울하긴 합니다만 작년 여름에 나온 보고서에 보면 지구 온난화가 벌써 1.09도 상승된 상태라고 합니다. 1.5도는 이미 2040년, 그러니까 우리가 2050년에 탄소 중립을 달성하겠다고 했는데 그보다도 한 10년 앞서서 이미 1.5도를 넘어설 것이다 라고 예상하고 있어서 사실은 굉장히 암울한 소식이긴 합니다. 그런 만큼 국제사회에서 기후변화 문제, 그다음에 온실가스 감축을 위해서 상당히 많은 노력을 하게 될 수밖에 없는 상황입니다. 이런 탄소 중립 목표를 달성하기 위해서 전 세계에 뭐 현재 기준으로 보니까 한 135개국, 이게 한 며칠 전에 검색을 해본 건데요. 135개국이 아니 136개국이네요. 136개국이 이제 탄소 중립을 선언한 상태이고요. 한국도 2020년 10월에 당 대통령께서 탄소 중립을 선언하셔서 이 136개국 중에 하나입니다. 대부분은 이제 유엔의 보고서에 따라서 2050년을 타겟으로 탄소 중립 목표를 발표했는데 조금 안타깝게도 중국과 러시아는 2060년, 그다음에 이제 인도는 2070년을 탄소 중립으로 선언하고 있습니다. 이제 이들 나라가 이제 온실가스를 꽤 많이 배출하는 나라들이기 때문에 기후 변화의 관점에서는 조금 걱정하는 목소리가 많이 있습니다. 한국의 상황을 조금 말씀을 드리면 한국의 경우에는 이제 본격적으로 한 1980년대, 90년대쯤부터 산업화가 아주 급속한 속도로 이루어집니다. 그래서 한 90년쯤부터 아주 급격하게 온실가스 배출이 늘어나다가 2018년을 정점으로 해서 이제 꺾이기 시작합니다. 그래서 조금씩 내려가고 있고 현재까지 공식적으로 나온 데이터는 2020년까지의 데이터인데 그 최고점인 18년도에 대비해서 한 10% 정도 감축된 것으로 나옵니다. 물론 이게 온실가스 감축 노력에 의해서인 건지 잘 아시다시피 2020년부터 이제 코로나가 이제 영향을 미쳤던 시점이기 때문에 그 코로나의 영향으로 이 온실가스 배출량이 조금 줄게 된 것인지 이 부분에 대해서는 좀 논란이 있긴 합니다. 그러나 어쨌건 데이터상으로는 18년을 정점으로 해서 조금씩 줄어들고 있는 모습을 보이고 있습니다. 한국의 국내 온실가스 배출량을 부문별로 한번 살펴보면 가장 온실가스를 많이 배출하는 영역은 역시 이제 산업과 발전, 그러니까 전기 생산하는 부분입니다. 각각이 약 35%, 35% 정도를 차지한다고 보시면 되는데, 다만 이 산업 쪽에는 이제 자기 공장에서 사용하기 위한 전기를 스스로 발전하는 경우들이 있거든요. 그것들이 이 산업 쪽에 포함되어 있기 때문에 순수하게 발전만 생각을 해보면 산업보다 발전 영역이 아마 훨씬 큰 비중을 차지하게 될 겁니다. 뭐 다른 나라들도 거의 비슷하게 발전이 굉장히 큰 영역을 차지하고 그 다음에 산업, 교통, 그 다음 건물 뭐 이런 순으로 보통은 그 온실가스 배출을 하는 영역으로 이렇게 순위가 매겨져 있습니다. 국내에서는 산업과 이제 발전 부분이 가장 온실가스 배출이 많은 영역이라고 말씀드릴 수 있습니다. 다음에 이제 한국이 2030년에 그 NDC라고 하는 그 자발적 감축 목표로 유엔에 제출한 그 양을 보시면 처음에는 저희가 이제 18년도 대비해서 약 한 27% 정도를 줄이겠다. 2030년까지 이렇게 이제 목표를 제출했었습니다. 그런데 이제 최근에 아까 말씀드린 것처럼 2030년까지 45% 정도를 줄여야 한다라는 것이 국제사회의 목소리이기 때문에 그걸 반영해서 27%로는 워낙 이제 좀 부족하다는 비판이 많으니까 40%까지 상향하는 목표를 새로 제출할 계획입니다. 보시면 지금 이 주황색 부분이 이 산업 부분입니다. 한국은 그 산업이 주로 온실가스를 많이 배출하는 산업이 주 산업 영역으로 되어 있습니다. 철강이나 그다음에 석유화학 뭐 이런 영역들이 보통 온실가스를 굉장히 많이 배출하는 산업 업종인데 이 한국은 그 업종들이 좀 주력 산업이기 때문에 이 산업에서 급속도로 온실가스를 줄인다는 것이 현실적으로 좀 어려운 부분이 있습니다. 그러다 보니까 주로 줄이려고 했던 것은 발전 부분이었습니다. 한국은 지금 석탄 발전이 상당히 비중을 많이 차지하고 있는 상황이어서 이 석탄 발전 비중을 줄이고 대신에 본래 계획대로라면 재생에너지 비중을 확 늘리면 발전 부분에서의 온실가스 배출을 상당히 줄일 수 있어서 이 계획했던 목표를 달성할 수 있을 것으로 생각하고 이제 이런 목표를 제출했습니다. 사실은 한국이 제출한 2050년까지의 탄소 중립 목표와 우리의 그 2030년까지 40% 감축 계획이 사실은 굉장히 야심찬 계획입니다. 비교해 보실 수 있도록 옆에 표를 하나 놨는데 영국의 경우에는 온실가스를 최고로 많이 배출한 시점이 1990년입니다. 1990년을 최고점으로 해서 2050년까지 계속 줄여나간다고 하면 매년 약 한 2.9%씩 줄여가는 겁니다. 반면에 한국은 2018년이 최고점입니다. 2018년에서부터 2050년까지 계속 같은 속도로 줄여간다고 예상한다면 한국은 매년 4.1% 정도를 줄여가야 되는 속도입니다. 그러니까 EU 국가들이 대부분 영국과 비슷한 정도의 감축 속도인데 그에 비해서 한국은 약 한 1.5배 이상 빠른 속도로 줄여가야만 하는 것이기 때문에 뭐 국내적으로는 상당히 도전적인 목표를 설정한 것이라고 말씀드릴 수 있을 것 같습니다. 이런 목표를 달성하기 위해서 당연히 법적으로도 여러 가지 제도들을 도입해서 이제 그걸 지원할 수밖에 없을 겁니다. 말씀드렸던 것처럼 우리나라에서 한국에서 가장 그 온실가스를 많이 배출하는 영역이 발전 부분, 그다음에 산업 부문, 그다음 교통 부문, 그다음 건축 부문 이런 정도입니다. 그러면 당연히 감축을 위한 제도들도 주로 그 부분에 해당하는 것에 집중될 수밖에 없습니다. 그래서 한국의 경우에는 사실 맨 처음 좀 기후변화와 관련된 법이 제정된 것이 2001년에 제정된 그 재생에너지법입니다. 그런데 이 당시에는 사실 기후변화에 대응한다라는 측면에서의 법이 아니었고 재생에너지가 새로운 산업으로 돈벌이가 될 수 있을 것 같다라는 이제 기대가 커지니까 그것을 이제 최대한 이렇게 지원하기 위한 성격의 법이었습니다. 그러다가 2010년에 들어와서 본격적으로 온실가스 감축, 그러니까 기후변화 대응과 관련된 법이 제정됩니다. 2010년에 제정된 그 녹색성장 기본법이라는 것이 이제 한국에서는 최초로 본격적으로 기후변화 이슈를 다룬 법이고요. 여기에서 처음 국가 온실가스 감축 목표라는 것을 설정합니다. 그 다음에 그 온실가스 에너지 관리하는 제도가 도입돼서 데이터베이스를 만드는 기본 작업을 하게 됩니다. 그러니까 각 회사나 뭐 건물이나 이런 데에서 온실가스를 얼마나 어떻게 배출하고 있는지 이 데이터를 만드는 작업을 하게 되고요. 그 다음에 이제 자동차에 대해서도 온실가스 배출 기준이라는 것을 도입해서 이제 제한을 하기 시작합니다. 그리고 2012년에 와서 이제 2001년에 만들어졌던 그 재생에너지법이 이제 본격적으로 산업 지원의 관점이 아니라 기후변화 대응의 관점으로 이제 재생에너지를 바라보는 그런 제도를 도입하는 법이 생기게 되고요. 여기에서 이제 재생에너지와 관련된 RPS라고 하는 제도를 처음 도입하게 됩니다. 그리고 그 12년에 역시 한국의 온실가스 배출권 거래제법이 제정이 되고요. 온실가스 배출권 거래제는 사실 국가 차원에서는 EU 국가와 한국 정도가 거의 전 세계에서 국가 차원에서 온실가스 배출권 거래제를 시행하고 있는 나라라고 할 수 있을 건데요. 굉장히 특징적인 제도라고 할 수 있습니다. 그리고 이제 13년쯤에 그 건축물과 관련된 제도가 법이 제정되면서 결국 2010년대 초반에 이제 기후변화 대응과 관련된 법 체계의 그 전반을 좀 구축하게 됩니다. 그리고 그 이후에 이제 국가 온실가스 감축 목표를 계속 조금씩 변경해가는 변화가 있었습니다. 가장 최근에 있었던 국가 온실가스 감축 목표는 본래 최고점 대비 24.4%를 감축하겠다라는 것이 최근의 목표였습니다. 그런데 아까 말씀드린 것처럼 우리가 유엔에 제출한 목표는 이제 40%를 감축하겠다입니다. 2030년까지. 그 발표는 이제 2010년에 한국이 탄소 중립 2050년 탄소 중립을 선언하고 2021년에 관련된 시나리오와 그다음에 가장 큰 변화라고 할 수 있는 탄소 중립법을 만들면서입니다. 작년은 한국에게는 기후변화 정책과 관련해서 상당히 큰 변화가 있었던 한 해였습니다. 말씀드린 탄소 중립 기본법이 제정되었고요. 여기에서 국가 온실가스 감축 목표를 40%로 대폭 상향하게 됩니다. 그 이외에도 2050년 탄소 중립을 법에다가 명시하게 되고요. 그다음 기후 대응 기금이라든지 정의로운 정책과 같은 새로운 정책들을 규정하게 됩니다. 이 탄소 중립법은 보시는 것과 같은 기본적인 체계를 갖추고 있고 중요 사항은 이 파란 글씨로 되어 있는 것입니다. 2050년 탄소 중립을 국가 목표로 규정하고 있고 말씀드린 것처럼 2030년까지 40% 온실가스 감축 목표를 정하고 있습니다. 그 이외에도 이 법은 크게 온실가스 감축, 기후 위기 적응, 정의로운 전환, 녹색 성장 이렇게 4개의 파트로 구분을 하면서 온실가스 감축에서는 온실가스 기후변화 영향평가라는 제도를 새로 도입하고 그다음에 온실가스 감축 인지 예산 제도, 즉 국가 예산을 편성할 때 온실가스를 얼마나 배출하거나 감축하는 예산인지를 보겠다라는 이런 제도가 도입되고 그다음에 기후 위기 적응과 관련해서는 기후 위기 적응 대책이라는 것을 새로 넣고 그다음 정의로운 전환, 녹색 성장은 기존에 있던 이런 제도들을 많이 받아오게 됩니다. 그다음 이제 재원 마련을 위해서 기후 위기 기후 대응 기금을 설치하도록 한 것도 이 법의 굉장히 중요한 내용입니다. 사실 세부적인 내용은 법에 담겨 있지는 않고 2050년 탄소 중립 시나리오라는 것에 좀 담겨 있습니다. 일종의 국가 계획인데요. 시간이 많지 않기 때문에 간단하게만 주요 내용만 설명을 좀 드리면 일단 그러니까 발전 부분에서는 화력 발전을 아예 안 하겠다. 2050년까지. 이게 이제 기본적인 목표인 거고요. 산업에서는 각종 기술, 그다음에 이제 연료 전환 이런 것들을 통해서 한 80%까지를 줄여보겠다. 건물에서도 신축 건물은 제로 에너지 건물, 그다음에 기존 건물은 그린 리모델링을 통해서 역시 한 88%까지 줄여보겠다. 수송은 전기 자동차로 전면 전환함으로써 90% 이상 줄여보겠다. 이런 것들이 주요 내용입니다. 다음으로 폐기물에서는 쓰레기 감축, 그다음에 쓰레기를 처리하는 과정에서 나오는 메탄을 회수하는 거를 통해서 약 한 75% 정도를 줄이겠다. 그다음에 그 농축산 부문에서는 바이오매스를 활용한다든가 그다음에 친환경 농법을 시행한다든가의 방식으로 약 37% 정도 줄여보겠다. 이런 목표들을 가지고 있습니다. 계획들을 가지고 있습니다. 여기까지가 어떻게 보면 이전 정부가 설정한 기후변화 정책의 방향입니다. 그러면 얼마 전 이제 임기가 시작된 그 새로운 대통령은 어떤 내용을 기후변화 정책으로 공약했고 정책으로 설정했는지를 간단하게 소개해 드리겠습니다. 사실 이번 정부의 기후변화 관련 정책의 가장 큰 특징은 원자력 발전에 비중을 두겠다라는 것입니다. 그래서 지금 건설이 취소된 원자력 발전소를 다시 짓고 원자력 발전 비중을 30%대를 유지하겠다. 현재 국내적으로는 한 25% 정도가 원자력 발전 비중입니다. 그걸 한 30%대로 유지하겠다. 뭐 이런 정책이 가장 비중이 있게 나와 있는 겁니다. 그리고 특징적인 공약으로는 전기 자동차가 아닌 내연기관 자동차의 경우에는 2035년부터 신규 등록을 금지하겠다. 그 다음에 화력 발전의 비중을 대폭 줄이겠다. 이런 공약들을 제시했었습니다. 그리고 최근에 이제 신정부의 110대 국정과제라고 해서 이제 임기 중에 주요하게 해야 될 일들을 쭉 발표를 했는데 거기에서도 역시 공약과 비슷하게 30년 원전 비중을 계속 늘리겠다라는 얘기를 하고 있고요. 그 다음에 이제 무공해 자동차, 그러니까 전기 자동차나 수소 자동차의 비중을 대폭 늘리겠다 이런 얘기들을 주로 하고 있습니다. 다음으로 이제 역시 이제 뭐 다른 부문에서도 이제 탄소 흡수원을 확대한다든가 등등의 정책으로 기후변화 대응 정책을 추진하겠다라는 얘기를 하고 있습니다. 그나마 이제 그 기후변화를 공부하고 있는 사람들 입장에서는 국가 온실가스 감축 목표 자체는 준수하겠다라고 하고 있기 때문에 어떤 방법으로건 기후변화와 관련된 이제 정책은 큰 방향에서는 틀을 유지하고 갈 수밖에 없을 거다라는 예상을 하고 있습니다. 마지막으로 간단하게 이제 그 전망과 평가와 관련된 말씀을 좀 드려보겠습니다. 사실 신정부는 그 에너지 믹스와 관련해서 원전의 비중을 대폭 확대하겠다라는 정책을 계속 발표해서 사실 환경을 하는 사람들은 걱정이 좀 많긴 했었습니다. 원자력 발전이 가지고 있는 장점도 있지만 분명히 환경적인 단점도 있기 때문에 우려가 상당히 있었던 건 사실이고요. 그러나 현실적인 부분을 생각해 보면 원전을 하나 새로 짓는데 들어가는 시간이 보통 6, 7년, 그다음에 부지 선정하고 뭐 여러 가지 절차들을 다 밟아가면 한 10년 이상 정도 시간이 소요됩니다. 그런 것들을 감안한다고 한다면 지금 이미 부지 선정도 끝났고 기초공사도 끝난 2기의 원전, 그 정도만 아마 신규로 원전이 늘어날 수 있고 그 이외에 추가로 늘린다는 것은 거의 불가능하지 않겠느냐라고 예상하는 것이 전문가들의 예상입니다. 그런 관점에서는 원전의 비중을 늘린다고 해도 분명히 한계는 있을 거다. 그런 관점에서 그러면 그 나머지 빈틈을 결국은 재생에너지로 채울 수밖에 없거든요. 석탄 발전은 이래건 저래건 줄일 수밖에 없을 겁니다. 거기에 이제 한국의 경우에는 미세먼지 문제도 상당히 중요한 사회적 이슈이기 때문에 그걸 같이 고려한다면 화력 발전은 석탄 발전은 줄일 수밖에 없을 거고 그럼 그 빈틈은 결국 재생에너지로 채울 수밖에 없어서 재생에너지 정책이 크게 무너지지는 않을 것이다. 여전히 이제 그 재생에너지 지원 정책도 그 이전 정부의 기조를 유지할 수밖에 없을 것이다라는 예상을 하고는 있습니다. 다만 이제 구체적인 내용이 조금 부족하다라는 점에서 빨리 구체적인 내용들을 좀 이제 정책에 반영할 필요가 있다라는 얘기들을 많이 하고 있고요. 아마 멀지 않은 시점 안에 그 새로운 구체적인 내용들이 더 담겨서 발표될 거라고 예상하고 있습니다. 예, 시간이 너무 지나서 제 발표는 이 정도로 마무리하도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
감사합니다. 현수 말씀 잘 들었습니다. 시간 관계상 사회자의 멘트는 시간 관계상 사회자의 멘트는 최소화하고 토론자로 참여해주신 두 분 교수님들의 내용을 먼저 듣도록 하겠습니다. 발제 순서상 한승수 교수님의 토론 의견을 먼저 듣도록 하겠습니다.
My name is Seungsoo from Manoa University, and I'm currently an international visiting scholar at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. First of all, I would like to thank President Kye-Hong Kim of Korea Legal Research Institute and Professor Tae-Ung Baik, Director of the Center for Korean Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, for giving me opportunity to participate in 2022 KLRI Forum. It was my honor to participate in such a wonderful event. And thank you for presentation, Professor Jong-ho. I have studied civil law, international private law, and Roman law, and mainly have dealt with private relationships and transactions. So that I was very impressed by the scale of the presentation on international subject and world order, and it was very interesting to see the impact of the war in Ukraine to be explained. As I do not have in-depth knowledge on this field, I would like to request the discussion by simply telling what I felt and wondered after seeing the presentation. After coming to Hawaii, I learned something from the history of Hawaii, especially when I went to the Iolani Palace and listened to the domestic national situation of Hawaii, 1900. I thought that Hawaii had similar experiences at a similar time to ours. I've heard that and I've heard and read about Bukdo, but I didn't know much about other parts. But I had the chance to think about Hawaii and other islands of geopolitical and military importance in this presentation. And I also learned about the history of many islands near Korea and Russia. I thought that important is the cause in words between nations. Therefore, historically, the so-called just war theory has been studied academically. For example, Thomas von Aquin, a famous theologian and jurist, also discussed the just war theories in relation to the Crusades in his Summa Theologica. Through today's presentation, from our contemporary perspective, I learned that we need to look at the changes, the effects, rather than the basis or justification for that. In particular, through the flow of world history that many words have changed, I've learned that we need to pay attention to the changes in the world order that war will bring. It is said that Russia's influence seems to be weakened after the war in the presentation. Then it looks important what that means for the situation in Northeast Asia, including the Korean question. For example, if the Russia loses its existing power and China becomes a kind of superpower in its place, I wonder what attitude China will show when dealing with Taiwan and Japan. As China's strong ally, Russia has weakened. It is a question of whether China will take a more cautious step or raise its voice as a new superpower. Recently, I've also heard that China is trying to influence Kiribati and other Pacific Islands countries. More especially with respect to the conflict in Northeast Asia region, there is the dispute over the Sengaku, Diaoyu Islands between China and Japan, which is not in the presentation. I wonder, how do you think about that, and whether there is any risk of that islands or to help become a kind of flashpoint? The war in the Ukraine already have a huge impact on the global economy. I hope the war in Ukraine will end soon. I will end this discussion with this. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 그럼 김대인 교수님의 토론을 듣도록 하겠습니다.
Thank you for Dr. Hyun's insightful presentation. His presentation aptly shows the current status of international community and Korea's effort to address the climate change issue. As I am an administrative law scholar and my academic focus is public procurement law, I would like to comment on Dr. Hyun's presentation in these perspectives. Addressing climate change is the universal value which is acknowledged internationally. However, each country should choose their own method to realize this universal value. Korean climate change related law can give many implications to other countries, especially to third world countries. Korea has tradition of a developmental state in which the government takes critical role in economic development. And this Korean tradition can lead to two different paths in coping with climate change issue. On the one hand, Korean government can maintain tendency to put more emphasis on economic development in comparison to climate change issue. On the other hand, government can take strong initiative in climate change policy. It will be necessary to restrict the first path and strengthen the second path in coping with climate change issue in Korea will be important. In this regard, I would like to ask question whether there is peculiarity of Korean law in addressing climate change issue. To discuss more concretely, two things will be necessary to realize the GHG emission reduction target. One is the genuine will or endeavor of the government. On the other hand, is close cooperation of enterprises in this issue. First, if Korean government unwillingly takes the pressure from international community and does not have real will to address climate change issue, it will virtually be difficult to fulfill the target. To solve this problem, it is necessary that environmental policy, including climate change issue, should take appropriate status within the policy coordination procedure among various departments in Korean government. Because environmental policy tends to be conflicting with industrial policy, it will be helpful to establish climate change related council directly under the president, but it will not suffice for successful policy cooperation only by establishing this kind of council. And second, if the enterprises do not cooperate with government's emission reduction policy, the fulfillment of the target will also be different. There can be many methods to induce climate change laws compliance by enterprises. Among these methods, public procurement need to be mentioned. On May 20th, 2021, President Biden of the United States signed a long-anticipated executive order on climate-related financial risk. This executive order proposes to use federal procurement as a test bed for a variety of climate-related initiatives, from contractor disclosure requirements to agency use of climate data in making award decisions. Using public procurement as merit, that voluntary participation of enterprises can be enhanced. I would like to ask a question to speaker. What effort should be made in order that climate change issue can have appropriate status in policy coordination procedure within the government? And furthermore, what measures should be made to enhance the compliance by the private enterprises? That's my question. This concludes my discussion. Thank you so much.
네, 감사합니다. 그럼 혹시 추가적으로 플로어에서 질문이 있으면 질문을 좀 받도록 하겠습니다. Do you have any question on the floor?
You mentioned the limit on internal combustion engines that will be coming up. How strictly enforced do you think that will be? Is there a chance the government might back off that requirement?
네, 감사합니다. 그러면 그 노정혜 교수님 먼저 토론에 대한 좀 마무리 의견 좀 부탁드리겠습니다. 시간 관계상 한 2분 정도 부탁드리겠습니다, 교수님. 네.
Okay, thank you very much for your question, Professor Han. It's very insightful, and I have never spoken for only 2 minutes, but I will give my best efforts to keep it very short. The question that you raised concerning the just war theory, I think is actually very important in this, because it's the just ad bellum, during the war. As to when nations engage in conflict with each other, what are the rules that govern their behavior? And this is something, again, the Ukraine war is not something that is new. Nations have been at war continuously. But I think the important thing to realize is the UN-based 1945 world order, but it's superficial, and it's a post-World War II rule-based order that has been made. And essentially what we are seeing here is a direct challenge to the very order that has managed to keep itself the past 70 years or 80 years since 1945. One thing I just wanted to mention, in your comments, you mentioned the history of Hawaii. And in my presentation, I also mentioned the question of the takeover of Korea, by Japan, the dagger, etc. Hawaii is also, in a way, very similar. That the Kingdom of Hawaii was illegally taken over by the United States in the I forget the exact date, but the 1800s. And the difference here is just that the United States government under President Clinton has issued a official apology to the people of Hawaii for this illegal takeover, recognizing that even though Hawaii is the 50th state, at the beginning of the era, it was an illegal takeover. And now if you look into the history of Korea, the takeover of Japan, or the events surrounding the 1800s to early 1900s, there's never been an apology, and there's no just war a justification for that. So I just wanted to kind of mention that part, and just keep it very short. Yes, there is a flashpoint that is occurring in Northeast Asia, and those flashpoints are obviously over Taiwan, the Senkaku Islands, and over the Northern Islands, and of course including Korea. What is, I think, quite evident from the Ukraine war is just that Russia, I don't think, will ever regain its position in the international community that it had enjoyed previously. I think it's quite clear that there is a very strong opposition to the Russian aggression. And essentially what we are essentially seeing is a bipolar new world order led by the United States and led by China. And one of the flashpoints, obviously, is China and Taiwan. But the other important flashpoint is between Russia and Japan. As you know, Russia and Japan never signed a peace treaty after World War II because of the dispute over the Northern Islands. And the reason why the Northern Islands is so important in this, that's right above north of Hokkaido and behind Sakhalin, is what we call the first island chain, which basically restricts all of China from the open seas. And the first island chain ends at the Northern Islands. And if the Russians were ever to give that up, essentially what the Russians and the Chinese would have is kind of access through that point to the open seas. So therefore, that will never get, I don't think, resolved. And of course, Taiwan is tremendously important for the first island chain defense, because if Taiwan falls to China, then essentially China has open access to the Pacific Ocean. So again, I think one of the kind of important points that we have to keep in mind is that this is an ongoing conflict, and the Ukraine war in itself is perhaps just the beginning of how we end. And I kind of like to think of the Ukraine war as the kind of end of the original Cold War that we knew of it, and not really the beginning of another Cold War. So let me just end my comments there for now. Thank you.
네, 교수님 감사합니다. 그럼 현준원 박사님 부탁드리겠습니다.
예. 대강 한 3가지 정도의 질문을 받은 것 같습니다. 우선 첫 번째로 우리나라의 산업 특성상 굉장히 저항이 심했을 것이고, 그런 부분에 있어서 이제 정부의 의지가 굉장히 중요할 건데, 그것을 어떻게 유도할 수 있겠느냐, 뭐 이런 질문인 것 같습니다. 일단 아까 말씀드린 것처럼 한국의 산업이 주로 온실가스를 많이 배출하는 업종으로 이제 좀 구성이 되어 있다 보니까 기업의 저항이 심한 것도 사실이긴 합니다. 그러나 또 한 측면으로는 한국이 수출에 상당히 의존하고 있는 나라이기 때문에 국제적인 논의의 동향에 어쩔 수 없이 따라갈 수밖에 없다는 것도 인정하는 것이 분위기입니다. 그런 관점에서 여러 가지 저항이나 반대가 있는 것도 사실이지만 설득하기 어려운 정도의 수준은 아닌 걸로 보입니다. 그래서 지난 정부의 경우에는 비교적 의지를 가지고 좀 적극적으로 기업을 설득하려는 노력을 해왔던 것이 사실이고요. 반면에 이제 현재 정부가 그런 정도의 의지가 있겠냐라는 걱정을 하는 사람들도 있기는 합니다. 그러나 여러 가지 산업계의 분위기나 그다음에 국제사회의 분위기로 봤을 때는 어떤 형태로건 기업의 동의를 이끌어낼 수밖에 없는 그것이 우리의 현실이라고 생각이 됩니다. 그런 관점에서 큰 변화가 있을 거라는 생각이 들지는 않고요. 특히 기업의 이제 컴플라이언스를 유도하기 위해서 우리가 이제 사실은 배출권 거래제라는 것이 어떤 측면에서는 가장 강력하게 기업의 컴플라이언스를 강제하는 제도일 겁니다. 근데 거기에 플러스로 최근에는 ESG가 강조되는 그런 영향으로 환경정보 공개 제도가 굉장히 강력하게 이제 도입이 될 예정으로 있고, 이런 여러 가지 점들을 봤을 때 현재도 사실은 어느 정도는 기업의 컴플라이언스를 유도할 수 있는 체계를 갖추고 있다고 보입니다. 다만 이제 김대인 교수님 말씀해 주셨던 것처럼 공공조달, 그러니까 즉 정부에서 물품들을 구매할 때 이런 의무를 잘 이행하고 있는 기업들에게만 상품을 구매한다든지 등의 방법으로 훨씬 더 강하게 컴플라이언스를 유도할 수 있을 거라는 생각이 들고요. 이 부분은 나중에 국내에 들어가서 좀 더 강력하게 공공조달 부문에서 이런 제도들의 도입이 필요하다라는 주장을 좀 해야 될 것 같습니다. 물론 현재도 이제 그 친환경 마크를 받은 기업은 공공 조달에서 뭐 가산점을 받는다든가 등의 방식으로 이제 플러스가 되긴 하는데 그거보다 더 강력한 제도의 도입을 건의를 하도록 하겠습니다. 그다음 마지막으로 내연 자동차 규제가 어느 정도 엄격할 것으로 예상하느냐라는 질문과 관련해서는 사실은 새로운 정부가 2035년부터는 내연 자동차의 신규 등록을 금지하겠다라는 발표를 할 거라고 예상한 전문가가 별로 없었습니다. 굉장히 강한 제도임에도 불구하고 신정부가 이런 제도를 공약하고 거기에 국정과제로 선택을 했다라는 점에서는 분명히 굉장히 엄격하고 강력한 의지를 가지고 있는 것으로 예상이 됩니다. 이제 한 15년 정도 남은 것 같은데요. 한국에도 현대자동차나 기아자동차처럼 굉장히 큰 자동차 회사가 있고 그 회사들이 아마도 적지 않이 로비나 뭐 이렇게 해서 이 시기를 늦춰보려고 노력했을 거라고 생각이 됩니다. 그럼에도 불구하고 새로운 정부는 35년을 딱 못 박아서 이제 신규 등록을 금지하겠다라고 했기 때문에 그 정책의 의지는 상당히 강하다라고 판단이 됩니다. 예, 이상입니다.
네, 감사합니다. 오늘 세션 2에서 이렇게 다뤘던 한반도의 어떤 지정학적 위치를 둘러싼 어떤 코리안 퀘스천의 문제라든가 기후변화 같은 주제는 한국과 미국에서 가장 큰 관심을 가질 수 있는 주제라는 생각이 들었습니다. 오늘 좀 발제와 토론이 기본적인 거래의 담론이라든가 기본적인 현황, 전망들을 소개하는 정도의 이렇게 시간 관계상 이렇게 짧게 좀 준비가 됐는데, 다음 기회에 좀 더 이러한 문제들을 관련 전문가들 좀 더 모여서 심도 깊게 좀 논의하는 자리로 좀 이어졌으면 좋겠습니다. 아마 제가 잘 모르지만 어떤 노정원 교수님 발제나 현준호 박사의 발제를 들으면서 아마 이 부분들의 가장 큰 전문가분들이 아닌가 하는 생각이 들었습니다. 그래서 앞으로도 저희 연구원과 해서 계속해서 이런 문제들을 함께 논의해 나가는 기회가 되었으면 좋겠습니다. 오늘 참여해 주신 모든 분들께 감사의 말씀을 드리면서 세션 1을 마치도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much for the interesting session and sharing your expertise. We are running behind the schedule, so we're going to have only a 10 minutes break, and then we're going to start the next session at 3:55. Thank you.
아, 아, 아.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We are gonna start the second session. The moderator of this session is Professor Tae-Ung Baik, and he's going to take over the stage and then proceed the session two. Please welcome Professor Tae-Ung Baik.
Good afternoon. My name is Tae-Ung Baik. I'm Professor of Law and also Director of the Center for Korean Studies. Thank you again for joining this wonderful KLRI forum. And this is the second session of today's conference. For this session, we have three speakers and two discussants who will discuss very, very interesting and important issues, in contrast to some of the issues that had been presented in our previous session. We have three presenters, Dean and Frank R. Strong Chair in Law, the Ohio State University Morris College of Law, and also Dr. Lincoln Davis, and also Professor Summer Kim, professor from University of California, Irvine School of Law. On our Zoom online, we have Mr. and Dr. Pablo Sanch-Bayon, Assistant Professor in Commercial Law, Camillus Pontifical University. Next to me, we have two discussants. One discussant, Professor Mark Levin, who is the Director of Pacific Asian Legal Studies, and also the Director of Center for Japanese Studies at the University of Hawaii in Manoa. And he is also my colleague, Professor of Law at the William S. Richardson School of Law. Finally, the least discussant is Professor Jong-Chul Ahn. He is Assistant Professor from KLRI, University of Venice in Italy. And I'm sure this time difference is very kind of challenging, but I'm very glad that we managed to get together to discuss this conference. So without further ado, I would like to begin to ask our speakers to present on the topic. Professor Lincoln Davis will speak with the title, Reforming the Electricity Grid. Would you please go ahead? Please give a big applause to welcome him.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank KLRI for hosting the KLRI Forum and the University of Hawaii, Richardson School of Law for hosting us here on campus. It's wonderful to be here. So the paper I'm talking about today is about reformation of the electricity grid as it transitions in the climate world. This is part of a larger project that is looking generally at governance of electricity grids in the United States through systems called RTOs, Regional Transmission Organizations, that I'll be talking a bit about. The branch of the research that I've been working on is looking at this in the Western United States, but it's also situated within a comparative perspective, and we'll be looking at how other systems, using one example from the Western United States, how other systems across the world, potentially in Korea as well, have been changing their systems to adapt to climate change and the different kinds of challenges that climate change presents to an electricity grid that's built for a history of the past that doesn't exist anymore or that is rapidly changing. So let me give you a little bit of history then before I dive into this, because I think it's helpful in terms of understanding the sort of contours of what I'm talking about. Historically, electricity was produced from what were known as vertically integrated utilities. So these were systems like we have here in Hawaii or really across the globe that would do every part of the electricity system. So they would generate the power, they would move that power over a long distance through transmission. They would then deliver that power to your home, to your business, whatever's using it, or distribute it. So those three components of electricity were all bundled into one single entity that would do all three parts of the service. Over time, especially in the 1990s, on the heels of deregulation and restructuring of other industries like the airline industry, the telecom industry, the railroad industry, electricity as well in the United States became restructured. Often people will say that it was deregulated, but I think it's more accurate to say that it was restructured because the way in which it was regulated really started to change. So there were really three different steps to this process that are relevant here. The first is that many different states required their utilities to divest. And what that did was it broke up the vertical integration of those utilities. This varied widely from state to state. Some states required their utilities to actually sell off their generation units to other entities that had not owned them in the past. Other states simply required the utility break into different corporate forms, and so it had sister utilities owning different parts of the system. And others just generally encouraged competition either at the wholesale level amongst utilities or at the retail level amongst customers. The crisis in California that occurred right at the turn of the century, if anyone remembers the word Enron, something that's sort of been erased from most of our memories, or at least from our current history, that the sort of manipulation of the market that Enron and other entities were engaging in really changed what this looked like. And California, which had been a leader in divesting and reshaping the electricity system, then became seen as a pariah. And really, the Enron debacle in California sent chill waves all over across the country. And so many states that were thinking about divesting stopped. Meanwhile, in 1996, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, issued its Order 888, which is sort of a weird number. And just as a footnote, if you ever go to their headquarters, their address is 888 First Street Northeast. I thought that couldn't be a coincidence. I asked a former commissioner at one point, and I don't think he was supposed to divulge it, but that is the genesis of the order's name. So what this order required was that big utilities that own transmission, remember the big systems that ship the power across the country, they had to open up their systems to competitors to use them on a first come, first served basis. So this isn't quite common carrier access, but what it did was open up competition so that most of the power that's now sold in the United States at the wholesale level is sold at competitive rates rather than on a historically cost of service regulated basis. The other thing that FERC did was in 1999 issued an order called Order 2000, which in its proposed form was going to require all utilities across the country to enter into organized wholesale markets run by independent operators of those markets or of the systems, and in fact also to turn over control of their systems to have them operated by these independent entities. There was a lot of pushback to that proposed order, particularly from politicians in the southeast of the United States and in the west of the United States. And so in its final form, Order 2000 encouraged entities, utilities to join these entities, ISOs or RTOs, and run in these independently operated systems and also have markets functioning. as a result, what you ended up with was most of the United States being covered by RTOs. In fact, roughly 80% of the country is covered in terms of electricity that's delivered by these RTOs. There's several of them in the Mid-Atlantic states, PJM. In the Midwest, it's either the Midwest ISO or SPP. New York has its own. California has its own. New England has one. So, and then Texas, or most of Texas has one. So this is the map of where the RTOs are today in the United States. This is a big shift from where we were, say, 20, 25 years ago. But let me give you a little bit of context about sort of how these have shaped up over time, because that context is, I think, also relevant to the question that I'm exploring, which is, will there become an RTO in the West? What might that look like in terms of addressing climate change, and how might that compare to other systems across the world in terms of their experience and what they're doing to reshape their systems? So this is what electricity production in the United States looks like today. It's just shy of 40% natural gas, just over a fifth coal, about a fifth nuclear power, a very minuscule portion of petroleum, which is really just backup power, or a little bit different maybe in Hawaii, and then about a fifth from renewables. And just to give you a sense of how much this has changed, even in about 15 years, here's what production of electricity has looked like in the US over time. 15 years ago, about half of the electricity produced in the United States was from coal. That's now down to almost 20%. At the same time, 15 years ago, about 20% of the electricity in the United States was produced from natural gas, which was a rapid increase, and now it's almost 40%. And renewables for a long time were just a sliver of production, and now they're almost a fifth as well. So we can talk at length about some of the forces and laws that are changing this. The RPS in Korea was mentioned previously. Certainly RPSs in the US have driven some of this as well as other industrial and technological changes. But this is helpful context to understand why an RTO in the West may now be pertinent the way that it wasn't 25 years ago. Just to give you a sense as well, in terms of renewables, hydroelectricity for a long time has been the primary source of electricity production for renewables in the US. That has rapidly changed, particularly as wind has grown. Solar is also rapidly increasing as well. Now, you notice that I mentioned much of the US is covered by an RTO, and I refer to the grid as though it's a singular entity. But in fact, the grid is not a singular. They're basically, if we ignore Alaska and Hawaii, no offense, basically three grids in the United States. There's the Eastern interconnection, which is most of the Midwest to the Eastern seaboard. There's Texas. Texas always has to do its own thing, and they do their own thing on electricity as well. Much of Texas is covered by its own grid, the Electricity Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT. And then there's the Western interconnection. You notice that the Western interconnection is the part that basically has no RTO. So one of the three grids in the US basically has no RTO except for California. So you can see what that kind of looks like, how that maps on. In other words, there's a huge chunk of the United States, most of one grid, that has no RTO at all. And the way it operates instead is there's about 40 different separate entities that are trying to balance simultaneously electricity across the West. They have to talk to each other. They've been pretty good about doing that, but you can imagine how 40 different entities trying to coordinate and sync their electricity in real time might hold back in terms of economics and other kinds of advantages that a broader planning mechanism in the West might have. Okay, so what might the future of the West look like then, particularly from an electricity perspective, and what an RTO might do for it? I think it's helpful to root ourselves in some context in terms of what the West looks like, right? Here's John Wayne. We have Professor Kim sitting next to me. If you fly in to see her at UC Irvine, you're probably going to fly into John Wayne Airport. I put that up in part because I think it's sort of an old vision of the West. But also, I think that old vision of the West is still deeply ingrained in how people think about operating in the West. So I'll talk about that in a minute, but I think it's helpful in context. Of course, there's a question of what the West is looking like now, and climate change has already started to radically transform what the Western United States looks like. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but obviously wildfires are one physical manifestation that are quite real in terms of how the West is functioning. So there are three key things or trends that I think I would identify that are really changing what the West might look like. And they are already in play, and they are only going to continue to increase. The first is that population growth in the West is rapidly increasing. If you look at what population in the U.S. looks like, most of the states that are rapidly growing are in the West. This is not California. These are states like Utah and Idaho and Arizona. In fact, much of the population that those states are gaining is coming from immigration from California to those states, but to other places as well. The second trend I would identify is drought. And in fact, the word that most scientists are using for the type of drought that the Western United States is experiencing right now is a mega drought, a drought that lasts for multiple decades at a time. The current drought really has been lasting since at least 2000. So 22 years. Most scientists think that it will continue to at least 2030. And most scientists say that this is now the worst drought the Western United States has experienced since 800 AD, so in the last 1,200 years. This has meaningful implications along a number of dimensions, including for electricity, because if you think about the availability of hydroelectricity production, that's deeply impacted by drought. If you think about the state of the grid and you watch some of the wildfires down in California and other parts of the United States, if you burn down a transmission line, that takes down a whole bunch of the system. So, and then if you think about the way that some of the thermal electricity production is available, it relies on water for cooling. So if you have less water, drought becomes a real impact. So this is an important trend generally for the region, but also particularly for the electricity system. And that leads really then to the third trend I would identify is that with an increase in population and less potentially available electricity, you see increased demand in a way that electricity now often is deemed to be inefficient or insufficient in the long run in the West in a way that planners hadn't ever anticipated before. I mentioned the 40 roughly different balancing areas or authorities that you have to manage in the West to produce electricity in the West. A year or two ago, they all realized many of them are relying on the same resources in the event of some of their existing generation going down to satisfy their demand. If they're all relying on the same resources, they're not going to be available to each other. They're only going to be available once. And so what this means then is the different utilities in the West realize, oh, we have a real problem. Maybe we need to do something different than what we've done before. Okay, so the thing that they're now, the idea that they're now looking at is, could we have an RTO in the West? And let me just talk for a moment about the three primary functions of what an RTO does. One thing that it does is it coordinates the system. It runs the electricity on a minute-to-minute basis and makes sure that the amount of electricity being produced is the amount that's needed. Right? If you and I turn off the light switch in here, we'll change how much electricity needs to come into the system on an instantaneous basis. In fact, you know, the two largest machines in the world probably are the Western interconnection of electricity in the United States and the Eastern interconnection, basically giant machines that have to be balanced all the time. So an RTO coordinates that across a whole bunch of different utilities. In the West, that would be almost 40 of them, in a way that provides efficiencies and planning that might not happen otherwise. The second thing that an RTO can do is to run different markets. Typically, an RTO will run at least two different markets. It will run a day-ahead market the plans for what the next day will look like based on weather forecasts and the conditions of the system. And will also run an instantaneous or real-time market to keep the system in balance. Some of the RTOs will also run a third market called the capacity market. It's a long-term market, not day ahead, months or years ahead, to make sure there's enough new electricity coming into the system. The third thing that an RTO can then do is plan for the future, based either on the market or other types of exercises, to figure out what the system will need, what it will take to get there, and how to plan for transmission and for generation. As you might imagine, building a new electricity system, any component of it, whether it's a transmission line or whether it's a generation facility, takes some time, and so planning is really important. So the question then becomes, why is there no RTO in the West right now? This is a story that began, around 2000 when the West said, no, don't force us to do this. But it's persisted for years. And in fact, there have been at least 5 documented prior attempts to create an RTO in the West that have all failed. So one thing that I would point out is that deeply ingrained within the Western ethos is the idea of independence. We will do it ourselves. And that manifests in a lot of different ways, but particularly with Order 2000, it manifested in the way that it often does in the West, which is federal government, don't tell us what to do, we've got this. So that is something that is pervasive and real, and it persists today, and it's informing the conversation. A second reason is geography. If you look at the West, just in terms of where the population centers are, they're much more spread out than they are, say, for instance, in the northeastern corridor of the United States. So that geography, the need to create bigger transmission pathways is a barrier itself, as is incumbency of these utilities that have existed for a long time, and unlike much of the rest of the United States, are still, for the most part in the West, largely vertically integrated. And so they have a lot of vested interest in keeping the system as it is. The final thing that has been a barrier is governance. And what I mean by governance here is, how does the RTO function? If you notice, in terms of the map, the only RTO that exists in the West is in California, and much of the West views California as really only second to the federal government in terms of an evil. They don't want to have the policies of California exported into their states. They don't want the politics of California exported into their states. And so when it comes to an RTO, something that's unique about the California RTO is that it's created by state statute and it's run effectively through the governor. The governor appoints the board that runs the RTO in California, and so you have a lot of state control over that. And other states and other utilities are afraid of that, and when you talk to them confidentially, they will tell you, we are afraid of that. So these are barriers to why there is no RTO in the West. Okay, so in my remaining moment or two, let me just talk about where this might go. My crystal ball is maybe a little bit more informed than the average crystal ball, because I've conducted about 30 to 40 interviews with participants in the Western electricity markets, utilities, regulators, et cetera, to see where they think things are heading. But it's not particularly clear exactly where we're going to go. What I do think is probably likely, not certain, but likely, is that some kind of RTO will form in the West. It may be more than one. Okay, so there have been several things that have been happening. The California RTO did start a voluntary market that non-participants in California, so these other 38 entities, could participate. It's only a real-time market. It's not a day-ahead market, but it started in 2015, and more entities keep joining it. It saved a lot of these utilities money, and they like it. The California RTO has also said they're going to create a day-ahead market, and that's coming. But meanwhile, if you remember looking at the map, the other RTO that's near the West, the Southwest Power Pool, which is really a Midwestern entity, they've started creeping in as well, and have started their own real-time market, and they're starting to roll out a day-ahead market or a bundle of services that they say will look like an RTO in the West. And on top of this, you have some states that have adopted legislation, Colorado and Nevada most prominently, that say their utilities must join an RTO by 2030. And you have utilities across the West getting together in a collaboration called WMEG, or the Western Market Exploratory Group, that looks a little bit different than the Redux clarified paths, but rather looks like a new wave that might move forward to an RTO. So right now, what we have in the West is just California. We have SPP creeping in. We have many entities across the West having joined the EIM, or this real-time market that California runs. And so what we might end up with is a single market that would require California probably to change its legislation, so I'm skeptical of that. You could have a market that's the rest of the West without California. I'm not sure we get there, but I think what you might have is some version of that bottom graph, maybe not that one, but something a little bit different, where you have 2 or 3 RTOs besides California in the West, creating a pathway forward. And which leads to my thesis, or at least one of my theses here, and then I'll stop, which is that California risks being left behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting to understand the current status of U.S. In terms of energy system reform. And I think we have questions on this presentation, but please hold it until the end of all of the presentations as well as discussions. So our next speaker will be Professor Summer Kim, Summer Kim, from University of California, Irvine, and her title of presentation is Decentralization and Democratization.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Professor Baik, and thank you so much for hosting us here. It's really been a pleasure and honor to be a part of this group, and it was wonderful to reconnect with Dean Nelson. And also, I just wanted to say that both the KLRI and the Center for Korean Studies have really been my role models. I'm currently serving as the director of the Korea Law Center at UC Irvine, and the Korea Legislation Research Institute has really modeled what intellectual and academic exchange across different jurisdictions and continents looks like. And I truly hope that one day we'll be able to host you at UC Irvine. And Professor Baik, I'm enamored with your center. I think I'm going to have to put a picture of it on my vision board. As of now, the Korea Law Center is just a bookshelf in my office. So I have a long way to go. But in addition to leading the Korea Law Center, I also teach contracts and corporations and corporate social responsibility at UCI. And in recent years, I've become increasingly interested in the role of emerging technologies in democratizing and creating more inclusion in corporate governance. So that is the topic that I will be speaking on today. The title is Decentralization and Democratization. And one of the most pervasive and misused myths in US corporate law is that corporations are governed in ways that are similar to a civic democracy. While there are some surface level and abstract similarities, there is a recurring election and an elected governing body that has a fiduciary duty to serve all of its constituents. The similarities really end there, and a closer look at the inner workings of how corporations operate reveals that there is a great distance between the myth and the reality. One thing, though, is that emerging technologies like blockchain and smart contracts have shown us the potential to reduce that gap, that distance between myth and reality, and that is the topic that I wanted to speak to you about today. So the key points of the talk, really the key word here is Web3. Many of you are probably very familiar, but Web3 refers to a new iteration of the web that is based on blockchain technology, which is itself based on decentralization and tokenization. And one of the expected, although not necessarily guaranteed, consequences of decentralization is the diffusion and distribution of centralized power. In the corporate context,
centralization of power and also wealth has traditionally been understood to be a necessary evil, especially in the context of large public corporations. The general understanding is that when you have diffuse and diverse and numerous and constantly changing shareholders and stakeholders, the only way that you can maintain efficiency and continuity is by housing control within a centralized and very distinct and very limited body. However, what we see, and in particular, I will introduce two case studies that demonstrate this. These Web3 technologies have offered a democratization tool which opens the pathway for a new future of corporate governance. So I'll begin by speaking very quickly about the relationship between corporate governance and civic democratic governance. I'll talk about some of the threats on corporate democracy and the resulting proposals to democratize corporate governance. Some of the pushback to those proposals have been this idea that although it's ideal in theory, it could never be done in practice. I wanted to introduce to you two case studies, one of Bored Ape and one of Luna DNA, that actually show that democratization, the distribution of wealth and power to a larger group of stakeholders is not only feasible, but has been done with great success. So that leads us to the general idea that Web3 can be used as a democratization tool. I'll briefly touch on some risks and challenges, and to the extent there is time, looks like I have infinite time because that clock is stopped at 3:45 and is not moving, but I'm sure someone at the panel, oh, thank you, will also show me a sign when I'm ending, when I'm reaching the end of my time. And I'll speak, if I have time, about the direction for future research. Okay, so where do we begin? Where can we trace back to when we think about the relationship between corporate and democratic governance? I think this quote from Steve Petrovich explains it well. The traditional theory of corporation government is that stock ownership confers votes, which in turn control the choice of directors. In this sense, the government of the corporation has been derived from democratic theory. On the right-hand side, you'll see an annual meeting proxy card. If you are a shareholder of a corporation, you might have seen one of these. I see a Korean name among one of the candidates, S. June Lee. And so as a shareholder, I think, yeah, you would mark for or withhold and mail it back in at the next, for the next annual shareholder meeting. And in fact, this understanding or presumption that corporations operate like a democracy has been used as a rationale to expand corporate power. In the landmark decision, Citizens United, the U.S. Supreme Court held that the government may not keep corporations from spending money to support or denounce individual candidates in elections. And one of the pushback to this holding was the concern that directors might misuse corporate funding for political uses that would not further the collective interest. And in response to those concerns, the majority quickly explained that, oh, we can rely on the corporate democracy to protect the interests of shareholders. So in this sense, the understanding or presumption of corporations as a democracy has great legal and economic significance. And so it is important to understand what we mean by democratic governance, especially in the corporate context. This matrix draws from some of my own work that was published in the Harvard Business Law Review a few years ago. And there I drew from some of the influential thinkers on political democracies and theory, and tried to build and develop a framework that could be used in the corporate context to measure and compare the extent to which corporations are more or less democratically governed. Tilley, in particular, explains that a representative democracy is one that is inclusive, equal, protected, and mutually binding, which carried over to the corporate context would include broad participation from stakeholders, equal treatment among them, strong protections of the minority, and mutually binding decision-making process. What I found in my research, based on case studies as well as a study of general market and legal trends, is that there was an overall trend of de-democratization. There was reduced breadth, meaning fewer than 1 in 3 retail investors voted in the 2018 proxy season. And this is a very dismal number. If you think about the fact that in corporate director elections, the standard is actually plurality, not even a majority. So what this means numerically is that the winning directors actually might have garnered less than even 10% of the retail investor vote. And you contrast that to institutional investor participation, which hovered above 91% during that same period. There's also evidence of increased inequality, especially through the widespread use of dual-class stock. Here, I could have included a picture of Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg to illustrate the point that just one individual, even in a publicly traded billion-dollar enterprise, can harness so much power in just their own 2 hands. There's also evidence of increasingly reduced protections, such as blanket waivers of fiduciary duty waivers. And I also found prevalent instances of unilateral decision-making, such as boards being able to exclusively amend bylaws. And this is very significant because bylaws are traditionally understood as shareholder documents. And so to find that most firms include in their charter a provision that allows directors to exclusively amend these documents was a strong evidence of unilateral decision-making as well. Furthermore, this is just limited to the inequality and lack of inclusion and protection in just the shareholder context. But actually, shareholders are only one piece of a multi-piece pie. There are consumers, a group that I have a special affinity to. I mean, all of us in this room are consumers. We spend our money, our time, our loyalty to corporations. We are all employees. We spend, our talent, our time, our labor to our institutions. Why is it that among all of us, it is only those who contributed capital, investment capital, that are given that ticket to vote and that protection of the fiduciary duties that directors owe to shareholders? And this is especially concerning when we look at the changing demographic of the shareholder base. Gallup reports that 56% of Americans own stock. This is a very low percentage if you look at the history of stock ownership. Most of those who hold stock are high income, highly educated. And so it's clear that when we have a corporate democracy that looks to only shareholders as its vote-holding citizens, we are furthering a commitment to maximizing the wealth of the richest Americans. And what we find is that even among those shareholders, it is institutions and high wealth individuals whose rights are privileged. And so a lot of different theories and alternatives have been proposed, starting with the stakeholder theory, which broadly states that directors and executives must account for all stakeholder groups. Digging further, Margaret Blair and Mark Rowe have written extensively about giving employees ownership rights. There's also a long line of cases and scholarship on expanding governance rights to include creditors, especially in moments nearing insolvency. As I mentioned earlier, I have a particular interest in whether we could imagine a more inclusive corporate governance structure that allows consumers to participate in the future decision-making and value creation of corporations. I think this is especially important in the gig economy, in a crowd-funded economy, and with initial coin offerings, where consumers are essentially stepping into the roles that were traditionally associated with shareholdings. And so I've given the talk, several times speaking about why consumer interests matter in corporate law. And each time, the major resistance that I receive is that I understand what you mean about the enlightened consumer or the participatory crowd, but I just don't think that it can be done. There's just too many consumers with too diverse interests, and there's just no way that we can coordinate all of their decision making. What I wanted to share with you today is that there are actually really great examples of companies that have been able to include consumers in a meaningful way and be able to harness the creativity of consumers to create new wealth and new ways of realizing the corporate vision. So I don't know how many of you in this room are familiar with the Bored Ape Yacht Club, but this is a collection of 10,000 unique NFTs, non-fungible tokens, that live on the Ethereum blockchain. And as of May 2022, they surpassed $2 billion in all-time sales. And what is unique about the Bored Ape Yacht Club is that the purchase agreement grants each buyer unlimited worldwide license to use and copy and display the purchased NFT. This is in stark contrast to the traditional model where business controls the IP and the user is just the end user, right, who can enjoy the work but cannot make a profit or other creative use of it. The way they implement this distributed model of creation is through blockchain technology. The other example that I wanted to share with you is Luna DNA. This is a DNA collection platform that gives ownership interests to DNA contributors. This too is a complete flip around of the traditional model, where the traditional model, if you're familiar with Ancestry or 23andMe, is that a user had to pay the platform to give them, that swab, that cheek swab of their DNA information, of course, in exchange for a report. But once they mailed in that sample, the company was able to control how that data is used, and the company generates revenue by monetizing the genetic database. The Luna DNA model flips that switch and gives the contributor shares, ownership shares, whenever they provide a DNA sample. The contributor gets to decide thumbs up or thumbs down how and when their data is used. And when they opt for their data to be used and proceeds are generated, those proceeds are redistributed to each of those consumers in their capacities as members. And this has led to the creation of a more diverse database of DNA contributions, which can lead to more inclusive medical discoveries. And so these two innovations, the common denominator here is the Web3 technologies, the things that would include blockchain, smart contracts, non-fungible tokens, and decentralized autonomous organizations. And if we think about the relationship between Web3 and law, there's a little bit of a conflict in the sense that these Web3 tools are centered around deregulation and decentralization, and the role of law is really to centralize and to regulate. And so one way to untangle this knot is to really understand Web3 tools as a means and not the end. The ends are to create a more inclusive and trustworthy structure, which is aligned with the visions of law as well. And indeed, decentralized technologies are forcing centralized authorities to become more accountable. And in that sense, there has been a symbiotic relationship. To give just a few examples of how states have reacted to these developments, much of it has focused on acknowledging the function of Web3. Arizona has recognized smart contracts as valid contracts. Number of states, Oklahoma, Ohio, Washington, have updated their Uniform Electronic Transactions Act to include blockchain. Delaware, which is the most important state when it comes to corporate law, has recognized the use of corporate records on the blockchain. Nevada has been a very permissive state recognizing blockchain as a valid and legal form of record keeping, and also including specific prohibitions on taxing and charging fees and imposing any licensing requirements on blockchain business. Wyoming has really been the dark horse in this arena. They've gone so far as to recognize decentralized autonomous organizations, which are essentially code-run corporations that make decisions without human intervention as a legal entity, giving them the same legal status as LLCs. And so even with these developments, there are a number of risks. The first is a question about accountability. How can we trust these tools to serve the public interest when there is no centralized regulator? And another concern is that in the blockchain environment, users' identities are not always known. So it's hard to track down the individual for purposes of determining liability or responsibility. And this is connected to Dean Davies and Dr. Tanner's presentation, but the environmental impact is also very concerning. The fact that you have a distributed network means that you're going to need duplicate copies, many duplicate copies. And this creates redundancies. And it has been reported that Bitcoin uses more electricity than many countries. And the third concern is around inclusivity and diversity. Using cryptocurrency ownership data as a proxy, we find that it is largely male, a younger crowd with high education levels. And so putting this all together, what we see is that when we return to that matrix and use that as the lens to evaluate the democratization of Web3, we find that none of the features of inclusiveness, equality, or protectiveness, or mutuality are a given. So there is an important role for law to play, whether it's through disclosure or imposing minimum protection or disclosure of who owns what in order to guarantee that the vision of Web3 as a democratization tool can be fully realized. So to conclude, Web3 tools, as indicated by the case studies, have a very powerful potential to truly democratize the distribution of corporate wealth and power. However, even in these nascent stages, some of the familiar and especially problematic patterns, disregard for the environment, lack of diversity, and concentration of wealth are emerging and are at the risk of being repeated. And so the note I'll end on is that the role of law and regulation will be important to ensuring that the rewards of Web3 are realized and we are able to mitigate its harm. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Professor Samarkin. This is a really fascinating presentation. And again, we have a lot of more things to learn from you, but with just a moment after all the presentation is done. Our next and last presentation at this session is by Professor Pablo Sanz-Bayon, and the title of the presentation is Artificial Intelligence, Law and Justice in Europe, a Regulatory Framework and Current Challenges. Please welcome Professor Pablo Sanz-Bayon, who is speaking via Zoom.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your invitation. It is an honor for me to make this presentation at your prestigious institution. In addition, it is a very special for me to address an audience from a country as admirable as Korea. I want this seminar to contribute to strengthening the links between Europe and Korea, and also between my country, Spain, and Korea. In the field of legal science, and even more so in the branch of comparative and international law, our goal is to get to know each other better and to contribute from that mutual understanding to the construction of peaceful, lasting, and prosperous relations. I hope the topic that I am going to present now to be very useful for all of us. It will consist of an exposition of the legal policy of the Council of Europe and the European Union in the field of artificial intelligence and justice administration. Reliance on artificial intelligence for assistance in decision-making is on the rise. In order to remove human subjectivity and corruption from the judicial systems, computer scientists are increasingly using advanced information technology tools in the legal ecosystem. Artificial intelligence and its use with machine learning are among the contemporary technologies that have proved their utility in the emerging justice system, but also in the most traditional ones. The application of artificial intelligence has already produced robo-lawyers and chatbots that interact with humans to help them present their cases in traditional courts. As some research shows, digital algorithms are poised to bring more transparency to the justice system, as the conventional court judgments given by judges will be supported by the dedicated artificial intelligence expert systems. The applications of artificial intelligence and technology expert systems is particularly needed in those countries where judges are corrupt and the authoritarian regimes subvert the judicial systems to achieve their political objectives. Recent developments in digital justice appear as real opportunities to improve the quality and efficiency of justice. At the same time, they constitute unique challenges for the respect of the fundamental principles of the trio, essential guarantees of judicial systems such as the primacy of the rule of law, the independence and impartiality of the judge, the principle of adversarial proceedings, or the protection of fundamental freedoms. I strongly believe that the new technologies can help to make European administration more efficient. However, automating public power may also endanger fundamental values. These include not just fundamental rights, such as data protection and non-discrimination, but also cover rules and mechanisms that evolve for decades to control public power, including the principle of legality, transparency, due process, the right to a reasoned decision, and accountability. The automation of government challenges and disrupts these models, often leaving the individuals affected in a vulnerable position. The fundamental question I would like to discuss here is how the use of artificial intelligence by the European countries affects justice administration. Now, let's analyze some of the challenges we face. The first thing to point out is the fact that we often do not understand how artificial intelligence works, limiting our ability to comprehend the impact artificial intelligence may have in this respect. This is called the black box effect. In addition, certain groups of citizens are disconnected from digital governments twice. First, because technology may hold biases against them, and secondly, because they are not capable of engaging with technology. This double disconnect creates administrative vulnerability. For example, in some jurisdictions, certain required transactions with the government can only be done digitally, such as applying for a birth certificate or a benefit. This added layer of digital technology placed on top of bureaucracy may not only cause vulnerable citizens to feel excluded, but it may also affect their ability to exercise their fundamental rights. In recent years, discussions have intensified at the European Union level surrounding the potential use of artificial intelligence-driven technology. For instance, monitored and implemented artificial intelligence can speed up asylum processes, protect from fraud, unveil related abuses, and improve authorities' ability to quickly identify the vulnerabilities of migrants and asylum seekers. Artificial intelligence challenged Article 47 of the European Union Charter of Fundamental Rights, which contains the right to an effective remedy. Being aware that personal data is processed with the support of artificial intelligence is a precondition to exercising the right to an effective remedy. This is particularly challenging due to the black box effect and the fact that there is no access to information about the artificial intelligence technologies or algorithms used in specific processes. In this respect, from my point of view, it is very necessary to empower judiciaries and provide equality of arms between the victim and the defendant, for example, by shifting the burden of proof. Now, let's see what is happening in the context of the European law in general, and then in the framework of the European Union. The Council of Europe should not be confused with the European Union. Both institutions are international organizations, but play at different levels. Let's begin with the Council of Europe. Firstly, I would like to introduce the activity of the Council of Europe, European Commission for the Efficiency of Justice. This body adopted an action plan for a better justice for 2022 to 2025, aiming at reconciling the efficiency of new technologies and the respect of fundamental rights. This action plan sets the major orientations of these institutions, whose main objective is always to place the user at the center of the concerns, even in a digitized environment or in the course of digitalizations, by providing the user effective and quality public service of justice. The European Commission for the Efficiency of Justice has also adopted a revised roadmap for ensuring an appropriate follow-up of its European Ethical Charter on the use of artificial intelligence in judicial systems and their environment. The Charter provides a framework of principles that can guide policymakers, legislators, and justice professionals when they grapple with the rapid development of artificial intelligence in national judicial processes. The European Commission for the Efficiency of Justice view, as set out in the Charter, is that the application of artificial intelligence in the field of justice can contribute to improve the efficiency and quality and must be implemented in a responsible manner which complies with the fundamental rights guaranteed in particular in the European Convention of Human Rights and the Council of Europe Convention on the Protection of Personal Data. The European Commission for the Efficiency of Justice has identified the following core principles to be respected in the field of artificial intelligence and justice. Firstly, the principle of respect of fundamental rights. This principle ensures that the design and implementation of artificial intelligence tools and services are compatible with fundamental rights. One of the relevant developments of this first principle is that, in line with the idea of privacy of design, an artificial intelligence technology should be based on ethical by design or human rights by design approach. Secondly, the principle of non-discrimination. This principle tries to avoid the development or intensification of any discriminations between individuals or groups of individuals. Another concern about the use of artificial intelligence is particular care when the processing is directly or indirectly based on sensitive data. This could include alleged racial or ethnic origin, socioeconomic background, political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, trade union membership, genetic data, biometric data, health-related data, or data concerning sexual life or sexual orientation. When such discrimination has been identified, consideration must be given to corrective measures to limit or, if possible, neutralize this risk, and as well as to awareness raising among stakeholders. In third place, we find the principle of transparency, impartiality, and fairness. This principle aims to make data processing methods accessible and understandable. And it is known artificial intelligence algorithms used in predictive policing can be so complex that even experts struggle to understand everything that happens in the process and cannot always explain the decisions made by artificial intelligence. This lack of transparency leads to a lack of accountability. The question that arises here, in my opinion, is whether or not the administration should depend on a technology developed by a large technology company, also known as big techs. In fact, private tech companies that design and sell this technology are not legally required to reveal these algorithms, further participating in the opacity of the process, raising also major concerns about the responsibility of the private sector involved, power structures, and democratic accountability. In particular, regarding the power exercised by the private actors, it should be considered that the law enforcement often use tools and databases created by them, although they are rarely being subjected to a specific and consistent legislation around the world. Therefore, in many cases, it is not possible to ascertain the lawfulness of the personal data collected, as well as it results complex to understand the real functionality of the algorithms used. Essentially, there is a risk that the administration of justice is left to algorithms created by private parties, whose interests could not overlap with the public ones. Moreover, the lack of transparency in algorithm construction processes by proprietary companies and their accountability to the public should be a cause for great concerns. In fourth place, the principle of quality and security with regard to the processing of judicial decisions and data, using certified sources and intangible data with models conceived in a multidisciplinary manner in a secure technological environment. And finally, the principle under user control, precluding a prescriptive approach and ensuring that users are informed actors and in control of their choices. In conclusion, for the Council of Europe, compliance with these principles must be ensured in the processing of judicial decisions and data by algorithms and in the use made of them. Now let's move to the European Union level. Last year, in October, the European Parliament resolution on artificial intelligence in criminal law and its use by the police and judicial authorities in criminal matters was paused. The resolution brings together a number of different European Parliament resolutions published in recent months. In this case, the European Parliament warned of the risk of this technology when used for law enforcement and by the judiciary. Although the European Parliament also recognizes that the use of artificial intelligence can offer substantial benefits in efficiency and accuracy, the members of the European Parliament highlight the risk this technology poses, such as discrimination and interference with fundamental rights of individuals. These risks are present in any situation in which artificial intelligence is used, but may be exacerbated in criminal matters. This is precisely why the European Parliament stated that the use of artificial intelligence applications must be classified as high risk when it could have a significant impact on people's lives. This classification follows the draft proposal on artificial intelligence published in April last year. The draft proposal prohibits the use of certain artificial intelligence applications by the police and proposes a specific legal framework based on risk control and management. The use is not prohibited, but still poses a high risk. The European Parliament stressed that artificial intelligence systems must be designed in such a way that they protect and benefit all members of society to avoid having any negative effect. The decisions they make should be transparent and be able to be explained while striving not to have harmful effects and always respecting the fundamental rights and freedoms of individuals. More specifically, the European Parliament asked that the algorithms used in these systems be explainable, transparent, traceable, and verifiable to ensure that the results of these algorithms can be understood by all users. Likewise, European Parliament states that the police must only buy tools and systems whose algorithms can be audited, recommending open source software wherever possible. The European Parliament also proposes a legal obligation to prevent the use of artificial intelligence technologies in mass surveillance systems, because it does not meet the principles of necessity and proportionality. The proposed artificial intelligence regulation suggests that authorities ban its use in publicly accessible spaces. The European Parliament also highlights that certain non-European Union countries have adopted these systems and, in its opinion, they interfere disproportionately with the fundamental rights of individuals. However, it does acknowledge that the use of facial recognition technology by authorities, although it reaffirms that, as a minimum, this use must comply with the requirement of data minimization, data accuracy, storage limitation, data security, and accountability, as well as being lawful, fair, and transparent, and following a specific, explicit, and legitimate purpose that is clearly defined in law. European Parliament also notes that facial recognition technology is not at present as reliable in a forensic context as DNA or fingerprints. It calls for a permanent ban on the use of automated analysis or recognition in publicly accessible spaces of other human features, such as fingerprints, DNA, voice, and other signals, as well as moratorium on the rollout of facial recognition systems with identification functions in law enforcement until the technical standards can be considered fully compliant, except when identifying crime victims. The European Parliament uses the example of Clearview AI, a database of more than 2 billion images taken from social media and other websites, reiterating that the use of that service by law enforcement will not be compatible with the European Union data protection rules. Clearview AI services can be described as consisting in matching person to online image taken from a variety of social platforms. The service allows, for instance, an investigating officer to upload a photo of an individual of interest and search within the database, sometimes matching with somebody who is not necessarily the person at stake, being able to generate confusion or exchange of people. In this context, the use of such database raises several issues, including first and foremost, the origin of data. Indeed, as also demonstrated by the revealed documents, all personal data were collected in this database with any legal basis and without the data subject being aware that his or her image and his or her biometric data were included in such database. In the resolution, the European Parliament expresses its great concern over the use of private facial recognition databases by law enforcement actors and intelligence services. Therefore, the European Parliament requires member states to obligate law enforcement actors to disclose whether they are using Clearview AI technology or equivalent technologies from other providers. I would like to conclude with some final remarks. The potential for bias and discrimination arising from the use of artificial intelligence applications such as machine learning and algorithmic systems can be inherent in underlying datasets, especially when historical data is being introduced by the developers of the algorithms or generated when the systems are implemented in real-world settings. For this reason, strong efforts should be made to avoid automated discriminations and bias. As we talk today, the policy making should focus on making the use of artificial intelligence tools as safe as possible and to safeguard fundamental rights of individuals. In Europe, member states should collaborate, providing comprehensive information on the tools used by their law enforcement and judicial authorities, the types of tools in use, the purpose for which they are used, the types of crime they are applied to, and the names of the companies or organizations that developed those tools. From my point of view, law enforcement and judicial authorities should also inform the public and provide sufficient transparency as to their use of artificial intelligence and related technologies when implementing their powers. Finally, I think there is an important goal in checking artificial intelligence mechanisms' effectiveness by independent authorities. An independent supervisory authority with sufficient financial resources and personnel with a high level of knowledge and experience could be the ideal body for the fulfillment of this task. The assessments of this authority should be based on both quantitative data, such as statistics arising out of the efficacy of predictions of artificial intelligence mechanisms, and also qualitative factors, such as the conclusions taken into considerations case by case. Gamsamnida, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Bayon. This is, again, very, very interesting and fascinating presentation. Unfortunately, we are quite behind our original schedule, but I would like to ask you a little bit of patience. We will try to use 20 more minutes, if possible, to finish up everything. And our two discussants will cover most of the issues in all of the presentations together. But the first discussant will be Professor Mark Levin, who is Professor of William S. Richardson School of Law. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Baik. And I'll keep my comments short. We've been very fortunate today with so many outstanding talks on diverse topics. As to the second panel this afternoon, I'll just note my colleague, Professor Walsgrove, is sitting here, and both of these two talks would have been right up his alley. So I encourage you to talk with that guy at the end of the day. I actually have learned a tremendous amount, but that makes me limited as a discussant. I'd like to take a step back and discuss the overall meaning and value of today's event. First, President Kim, the legislative process, you may be surprised to learn, is not a required course in many U.S. law schools. And in fact, it is even complicated more in the United States with federalism and the diverse approaches among the states, each with their own constitution, as well as their own history and culture. But this brings into account the importance of comparative law for U.S. legal education. As Dean Nelson mentioned, for our students to understand their own environment of U.S. law that they will most likely spend their careers working in. As to this then, today's conference is a model and a signifier of comparative law in the United States and other nations' legal education systems. Already from today, we can see Korean law drawing attention at UC Irvine, Ohio State University, at the University of Hawaii, and in Europe at Comillas Pontifical University in Madrid and Ca' Foscari University of Venice in Italy. We've seen today how Korea's model informs us as to legislative processes, national security. I should have added Colombia. We've seen today how Korea's model informs us as to legislative processes, national security, environmental law, technology, commercial law, and business transactions, and heard from scholars with expertise in dispute resolution, administrative law, procurement, and more. Moving out more broadly, we can see that in the past 10 years or so, increasing cooperation and collaboration among East Asia specialists, whether that is the Law and Society Association CRN 33 on East Asian Law and Society, the establishment of the Asian Law and Society Association, which had an annual meeting at Yonsei University in 2011, I was fortunate to attend, or the American Association of Law Schools section on East Asian Law and Society. So I look at today's event in both a micro and a macro framing, valuing both the Korea-specific lessons that we can draw upon for insights abroad, and the meaning of putting this into a regional context, what Professor Tom Skinberg has called an East Asian legal complex, demonstrated by my being here today, where we know there have been frictions and we can hope instead and work for rich and beneficial fusion. I'd like to conclude with thanks to the organizers and sponsors, most notably the Korean Legislative Research Bureau, which had the sophisticated awareness to put its resources, time, personnel, and funding to put on this event, allowing us to build bridges among us personally and to strengthen the scholarly and institutional capacity in all of our home institutions. And of course, Professor Beck, my colleague, and his endless supply of energy for these endeavors. As was mentioned by Professor Kim, we do look at the Center for Korean Studies as an incredible template for what is possible in Asian studies. And I am very fortunate to have that right in front of me as I do my work. So mahalo to you all, and aloha.
Thank you, Professor Levin. This is a wonderful remark. Professor Richard Worsgrove, please don't go. I will ask you to speak at the end after Professor Jong-Chul An's presentation. So, Professor An,
yeah,
you have waited too long.
Thank you very much.
As our last speaker and discussant, I will invite Professor Jong-Chul An to speak. Go ahead, please, Professor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Particularly, my thanks go to Professor Mark Levin and Professor Beck, and great honor to see you guys again. And particularly that buildings, I had my PhD research by reading lots of historical documents in Center for Korean Studies. So thank you very much. And my comment is very limited. I'm living in Europe, and I look at lots of European treaties, European Commission's decisions, and regarding the first presenters, Professor Davis' papers, I look at the European Union's most widely known policy about energy consumption, energy productions. 2022, renewable energy should be increased to 20% and reduce greenhouse gas by 20%, and also increase energy efficiency by 20% until 2020. And then now, as you all know, that there is some kind of war in Ukraine, and how European Union's handle this energy crisis, that is also related to Professor Davis' maybe a presentation. And the second presentations, thank you, Professor Kim, and I learned a lot. And as far as I know, in 2014, European Commissions also passed a law to require almost all the important and the big companies, corporate, to publish their own corporate sustainability reporting, which have lots of some elements to be published. For example, as you already mentioned, the environmental matters, social matters, and the treatment of particularly employees, and the respect for human rights, and the anti-corruption and the bribery issues, and the diversity on company boards. So lots of issues are also related to maybe business democracies, I guess. And also the third presenter is Professor Bayon. Thank you very much for AI related things. I learned a lot, and also I think as far as I know, Korea has many problems with AI issues, particularly the big data issues, how to prevent some fake news in media. That was very important things. But on the other hand, I think, the Korea and the EU particularly had lots of mutual benefits since 2011. For example, in labor issues, at least on papers, there are many good laws. And then even forced labor issues, a lot of some kind of the missing laws in Korea was ratified by the Congress last year because of some EU pressure. So I think that this kind of thing may be a mutually benefit. So I think maybe in terms of AI and big data, particularly, I look forward to seeing lots of some progressive legal reforms in Korea. Thank you very much. I have a lot of things to talk, but just to stop my remarks here. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you. So would you please give Professor Worsgrove microphone? Rich, will you come outside to appear in the camera, in front of the camera?
I'm not sure what I've done to deserve taking Professor Levin's seat here. But I am delighted to say something. I actually have some questions for Dean Davies, but I now know that I can email him my questions or call him with my questions. But you might find it interesting thinking the spirit of Professor Levin's comments about where those questions came from. I was actually inspired by Professor Kim's talk and the concept of decentralization, which Dean Davies knows is a big topic in the renewable energy space. I'm thinking about what the role of these regional transmission organizations would be if, in fact, the energy system ends up being more decentralized and sort of adopts the principles that Professor Kim described. And so it's fascinating to me that what might seem like two disparate talks actually come together in my head. And moreover, I'm inspired to ask those questions in part because I think a lot about the Korean energy system and the role of potential transmission across, say, the Korean Peninsula into China, and those sorts of things. So the nexus here between the policies in Korea, which I've followed for a long time and used in my advocacy here in Hawaii, and the talks that you presented today are just wonderful. And thank you, Professor Beck, and the Center for Korean Studies and the Korean Research Legislative Institute. It's a fantastic opportunity to listen and learn.
Thank you very much. I'm really sorry that we do not have enough time to continue this discussion, but I think it's almost time to wrap up. So to each of the speakers, I'd like to ask to add some final remarks, maybe 1 minute per person. David, will you start?
Yeah, so let me just begin by again echoing thanks for this wonderful event, and especially to everyone at KLRI for being here. So let me just say two things in response to the question. The first thing I think I would say is that different states in the West have kicked around legislation. The only two states that have adopted legislation pushing things forward so far are, as I mentioned, Colorado and Nevada. Both of those statutes have provisions in them that require the RTO that their utilities might join to have no limits on allowing other public participants in their governance structure. I don't think that gets you all the way to democratization, but it does democratize the system in a way that I think we don't necessarily have now when you have privately held entities, publicly traded, but privately run entities really running the system. So that's a step maybe in the right direction. But the other observation I had was really sort of along the same lines as yours, which was actually, I thought all three of the talks were sort of unified in this notion of really core systems that underline how our modern economy and society run, whether it's AI or whether it's corporations, whether it's electricity, and that are really being transformed by technology today. But there being a lot of opacity into how society interfaces with them, and the ways that those kind of power systems really being shunted away from the public and away from government regulation of them in ways that are powerful and meaningful. I think really would spur a lot of research going forward, but also present really deep challenges for us as a society.
Yeah, I too wanted to use this opportunity to thank everyone for your attention, especially those who are spending their evening or early morning with us. It's really been an honor and pleasure to be a part of this conversation. And just to echo Professor An's remarks, I think the key building block to ensuring that these innovations do their intended work is by disclosure. And we have a lot to learn from each other in terms of the new disclosure mechanisms, what works, what is best understood, and what incentivizes companies to do better. And so the comment about the recent effort by the EC to regulate and mandate greater ESG disclosures is very much a hot topic here in the US as well, and in Korea as well. And so selfishly, I hope that we can continue this conversation on this very specific topic in our future discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kim. Professor Tae-Ung, would you please?
Okay, thank you so much for your invitation. It was a pleasure to be with you here online. Congratulations for this excellent forum on comparative law. And let me 1 minute to deliver one final remark. From my point of view, the situation of the European Union and the Republic of Korea is quite similar in a certain sense. We have a very developed legal tradition and commitment to respect human rights and also very high social and technological capacities. But nevertheless, we do not have enough power to determine technological development as other global players such as the USA and China. This is evident in the field of digital markets and services, and more specifically in the field of artificial intelligence and the applications of algorithmic systems in the markets. This field is being totally dominated by American and Chinese leading tech corporations. USA is leading the artificial intelligence race in terms of investments, research, and attracting talent, while its companies are in the front line of technology development. China, on the other side, is behind the USA, but catching up. The European Union has a long way to go, but policymakers believe with clear regulations and an investment push, it can catch up with competitors. So here, what I would like to say is that in this context, the European Union and the Republic of Korea can work together and cooperate actively to develop standards and establish universal principles for technology governance. So I hope we can further develop these ideas and discuss with you. And I was very happy to stay with you here online. Thank you so much for your invitation.
Thank you very much, Professor Bayan. This will conclude our session 2. I'd like to mention that this KLO Forum has been an annual event, and it is my great honor to host it at the University of Hawaii Center for Korean Studies. And our dialogue will continue in our next year's event. And thank you again for KLRI for your wonderful support and efforts to make this successful. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, speakers.
Thank you very much all for the great session. And then I'd like to ask you to give them and to all participants to a big round of applause once again. Now with this, we're concluding the KLO Forum 2022. And it was such a good opportunity to learn about a lot of current legal issues in various fields from different perspectives. And on behalf of the host, I would like to thank all participants and 3 professors from Europe and Korea to stay with us through the forum. And I hope to see you all in person next time at KLO 2023. Thank you very much. And I would like to ask you to stay on the stage. And I also like to ask all participants to up to the stage to take a photo with online professor. Online. And then do we have, okay.
professors, thank you very much for joining. And it was so nice. Do you hear me, by the way? Yes, it was so nice to see you guys, even if it is on the monitor. And we, by this, conclude everything. And hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you so much. See you soon.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Do you have something to say?
Professor Bayan, Professor 노종호 교수님, 안종철 교수님, 감사합니다. Thank you very much for
감사합니다.
today and for staying awake the whole time.
Take care. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
감사합니다.
감사합니다. Thank you.
감사합니다.
네,
감사합니다.
감사합니다.
Thank you.
네, 수고하셨습니다.
네, 감사합니다.